Hey there. I know why you're here. You're looking for a story that will help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Something calming, a little mysterious. Something that carries your mind away. Well, you've come to the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, do me a little favor. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Even just a good night. It really helps more sleepy souls like you find their way here. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's story. They say mirrors don't lie, but what if yours stopped telling the truth? It began on an ordinary night, in an ordinary apartment, with one extraordinary moment, a reflection that smiled without being told to. Not a twitch, not a trick of the light, just a slow, knowing grin that didn't belong. That night, the knocking began, soft, deliberate, and impossible to trace. And since then, nothing has felt real. Not the days, not the silence, not even his own face staring back at him. This is the story of what happens when your reflection becomes something else. Something watching, waiting, whispering words you'll never quite hear. What started as a strange smile became a waking nightmare. And as the knocking grows louder, one thing becomes chillingly clear. Whatever's on the other side of that mirror, it doesn't want to stay there. It started the way nothing usually does, with silence. The stillness, so complete, it almost felt intentional. He was brushing his teeth, late evening, winding down, distracted. The mirror in the bathroom was fogged around the edges from a lukewarm shower, just routine. The kind of evening that doesn't ask to be remembered. But something made him glance up. Maybe a flicker in the light, maybe something in the corner of his eye. He looked directly into the mirror and froze. His reflection smiled, just like that. A subtle, unnatural grin. Small, sharp, and completely wrong. Because he hadn't smiled, he wasn't even thinking about anything. His hands stopped moving. His toothbrush rested against his teeth, unmoving. But the face in the glass was grinning. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't distortion. It was personal. The kind of grin someone gives when they know you, or when they're mocking you. He stared, unblinking. His breath caught halfway to his lungs. Then the reflection stopped smiling. The face went neutral again. Normal, perfectly in sync, as if it never happened. He leaned forward slowly, the mirror just inches from his face now, looking into eyes that matched his own, but felt completely detached. He studied every angle, every contour of the glass. Maybe it had been a trick of the lighting, maybe a shadow from the hallway, but the more he looked, the more he realized how deeply disturbed he felt. Not just by the moment, but by how sure he was of what he'd seen. It had been precise, deliberate, not a fluke, not a random twitch. There was something behind that expression, a knowingness that didn't belong. He tapped the surface of the mirror gently. Nothing unusual. He stepped back. The reflection followed perfectly. He waved his hand. It mirrored him, beat for beat. But still, something lingered behind those mirrored eyes. Some invisible residue, a presence he couldn't name. He turned off the light and walked away, trying to leave the feeling behind him in the dark. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe the mind plays games when the body's worn thin. He hadn't been sleeping much. Work had been a grind. Stress builds up in small, quiet ways until it comes out sideways. He'd read that somewhere. Maybe this was one of those times. He poured a glass of water and scrolled on his phone, looking for anything to distract him. Social media, the news, the weather, the mundane rhythms of modern life. But it didn't work. Every few seconds he'd glance toward the hallway, half expecting to see movement. Nothing came, just that eerie stillness again. The apartment was as quiet as ever, but somehow it felt less like peace, and more like something holding its breath. The kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but rather occupied. He turned in for the night, just after 1 a.m. Lights off, doors locked, everything as it should be. He lay still under the weight of his blanket, the soft hum of the city filtering through the walls. It took time for his mind to slow down. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind outside made him jolt slightly. But eventually, his thoughts dulled and began to fade. Just as sleep began to pull at the corners of his mind, there it was, a knock. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 gentle taps. Like someone testing the door. He sat upright, immediately, ears straining. His apartment wasn't large. There was nowhere the sound could come from that he couldn't trace. But the knock had been real. He was sure of it. He crept to the front door, looked through the peephole. Nothing. Not a soul in the hallway. He checked the windows. Still. Silent. Empty. Maybe someone had knocked on a neighbor's door. Maybe the sound carried strangely through the walls. He returned to bed, but he didn't lie down. 10 minutes later, the knock returned. This time, it was closer. Not at the door, not from outside. It came from inside the apartment, from the hallway, from the bathroom. His stomach turned cold. He moved slowly now, not sure what he expected to find. He picked up his phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked into the hallway. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. He reached out, pushed it open, and turned on the light. Everything was still, quiet, perfectly in place. He stepped inside, careful not to look directly at the mirror yet. It felt like something would happen, the moment he did. And then, finally, he raised his eyes. The reflection stared back. Normal, no grin, no movement out of sync. But something felt off. He moved his right hand. The reflection did the same, but there was a slight delay. Less than a second, but enough to notice, enough to panic. He stepped closer. The lights flickered slightly overhead, and he watched as his mirrored self blinked. But it didn't match his own. It blinked alone. A beat too late. A breath too slow. Then came the whisper. Not a sound exactly, but a movement. The reflection's mouth began to move, shaping words silently. But they weren't his words. He stood motionless, watching lips form something unintelligible, something breathless and strange. He tried to mouth stop, but the reflection didn't copy him. It continued. He reached out instinctively, placing his hand against the glass, and the reflection didn't raise its hand in return. It just stared, just mouthed. A smile tugged at the corner of its mouth again, and for a fleeting second, it felt like he was looking into something older than him, something patient, something that had been waiting for this exact moment. He fled the room, slammed the door, turned every light on in the apartment, and sat on the edge of his bed, breath shaking, heart hammering. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't fatigue. It wasn't explainable. Something was wrong. He didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. And when the sun finally rose and bathed the apartment in pale gold, he walked into the bathroom again, slowly. The mirror looked normal, dusty, plain. His reflection looked like himself. There was no grin, no delay, no whispering lips, but he knew what he saw. And what was worse, he knew he saw it too. He awoke the next day with a sleepless tension coiled in his chest, a memory that refused to fade with dawn. The morning light poured in through the window, indifferent to the night's strange events. yet every ray seemed to echo the unease he felt. As he sat at his small kitchen table, the mundane clink of a spoon against a cup juxtaposed sharply with the memory of that whispered, lip-moving reflection. Even now, his mind replayed the bizarre delay in the mirror as if it were a film on endless loop. With each recollection, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the clatter of distant traffic became a dissonant chorus, intensifying a profound disquiet. He couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection was not bound by the rules of normality, that it had been aware all along, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal its secret. And though the apartment appeared unchanged, the same peeling wallpaper, the same quiet corners, the undercurrent of an inexplicable presence pulsed like a heartbeat in the silence. Each sound, each ordinary movement of the day was imbued with the possibility of another anomaly. It wasn't long before he realized that the events of the previous night had tainted even the clearest moments with the shadow of uncertainty. Later that afternoon, determined to confront the unknown in a bid to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, he returned to the bathroom. He approached the mirror methodically, as if each step might reverse the inexplicable distortion he'd witnessed. Yet as he lit the overhead bulb and faced the reflective surface again, the mirror offered nothing unusual. No delayed mimicking, no crooked grin peeking out unexpectedly. The reflection appeared meticulously accurate, almost too precise, and still a gnawing sensation of being observed clung to him like a second skin. He moved slowly, deliberately testing every gesture, a wave, a tilt of his head, even a deliberate pause mid-motion. For a fleeting moment, he caught a slight lag in his reflections blinking, a hesitation that might easily have been dismissed as a trick of overactive imagination. But this time, he refused to let the anomaly slip by unnoticed. He recorded the entire interaction on his phone, his hands trembling with both frustration and a desperate need for evidence. Later, as he reviewed the video in isolation, the playback seemed to smooth over the earlier irregularities, leaving him with the bitter taste of a mystery that defied logic. That feeling of being subtly mocked by his own image began to embed itself into his every thought, blurring the lines between his reality and the eerie realm of reflections. As dusk approached and the day's fraught energy seemed to layer over the apartment once more, he found himself caught in a cycle of intermittent sanity and creeping dread. The memory of the night's events manifested quietly in every creak of the floorboard and every unexpected flicker of the light. Even the simple act of washing his hands in the bathroom turned into a ritual of cautious observation. Each reflection caught in the gleam of the mirror became a silent question. Was it him, or was it something else lurking just behind the veneer of normalcy? His inner voice, usually so confident in its rationality, now whispered doubts of hidden eyes and secret smiles that existed beyond the reach of daylight. Uncertain if he was haunted by a figment of fatigue or by something more sinister, he began to record his thoughts in a small journal. Every scribbled sentence, every frantic note about the sensation of being watched, served as both a confession and an attempt to rationalize what he could not explain. And while the journal became a repository for his mounting terror, it also seemed to invite that eerie presence further into his psyche, as if the act of documenting the inexplicable was a tacit invitation for it to remain within his thoughts, forever blurring the line between observer and the observed. That evening, the apartment fell into a calculated hush, as though holding its breath in anticipation of something unknown. The air felt denser, weighted by the gravity of unsaid secrets. He sat in his living room watching the sunset with a wary eye, while his thoughts spiraled back to the mirror's anomaly. Every reflection in a window on a polished countertop in the darkened TV screen became a potential harbinger of the inexplicable. When the steady rhythm of the evening was suddenly interrupted by a soft, almost imperceptible tap at the door, his pulse quickened. The knock was neither loud nor insistent. It was measured like a metronome marking out a sequence only it could understand. His mind raced with questions. Was it part of the same phenomenon? A different manifestation of what was starting to feel like a breach between realities? Hesitating for a moment before approaching the door, he tried to steady his nerves with deep breaths, willing himself to find a logical explanation. But every rationalization collapsed under the weight of his inner turmoil. The silence that followed the knock was as loaded as the sound had been, and every subsequent tick of the clock amplified the dread that anything ordinary could be rearranged into something horribly extraordinary. Unable to shake the pervasive sense of paranoia that had now woven itself into the fabric of his every waking moment, he sought refuge in trying to control his environment. Yet, even the most deliberate efforts to impose order felt futile when every object and every reflected surface seemed laden with potential for another inexplicable twist. In the quiet of a late-night hour, when the city outside had finally settled into a deceptive calm, he returned once more to the bathroom. This time, his approach was different. A quiet defiance against the invisible puppet master that had toyed with his sense of self. With a renewed determination born from both exhaustion and desperation, he performed a series of simple, measured motions in front of the mirror. He spoke aloud, trying to command it back into alignment with reality. "Show yourself," he murmured, his voice steady despite the tremor that lurked beneath. In that moment, the mirror seemed to ripple with the slightest distortion, as if echoing back his own plea. For an instant, his reflection ceased its mimicry, leaving behind only a ghostly afterimage that flickered in the periphery of his vision, an almost imperceptible sign that perhaps the strange presence was now taking heed of his challenge. The intensity of the phenomenon deepened as night returned once again. The apartment, now a theater for an escalating enigma, seemed to warp with each passing minute. The gentle tapping at the door evolved into a rhythmic cadence that resonated against the walls, a sound that vibrated not just through the structure of the building but within the very core of his being. Each tap was deliberate, punctuating long stretches of uncomfortable silence, as if marking an agenda known only to the entity behind the mirror. In this new stage of the unfolding horror, every shadow played a role, every fleeting reflection held a message. The subtle cues merged into a coherent whole of unsettling signals. His mind, caught in a relentless loop of anxious anticipation, began to wonder if the days of peace had irrevocably ended with the appearance of that one unsettling grin. Every moment felt meticulously orchestrated to unsettle, to push him toward a precipice of madness, where the real and the unreal blurred indistinctly. And as each new tap grew louder, it also carried a silent accusation, a reminder that perhaps he had been marked, touched by a force far beyond the reach of ordinary human understanding. Now completely ensnared in the grip of a mystery he could neither explain nor escape, he found himself teetering on the edge of realization and dread. Every attempt at finding refuge in the simplicity of routine had yielded only the grotesque promise of the mirror's secret life. He started seeing subtle variations wherever of reflection. A slight, unnerving delay in his peripheral vision at the grocery store, a fleeting misalignment of images on the polished surfaces of his workplace. His inner world was now a labyrinth of half-remembered dreams, unexplainable phenomena, and a recurring image of that sly, mocking smile that had first shattered his sense of self. Even as he tried to convince himself that logic and rationality would prevail, there lurked an inescapable truth that every reflection was now a potential canvas for the unknown. It was as though the boundary separating the visible from the hidden had permanently thinned, leaving him exposed to a reality that defied the warmth of daylight and the clarity of rational thought. The sensation of being watched had grown so persistent that even his own reflection felt like another set of eyes, silently critiquing every uncertain step. By the time the hours crept into the early moments of the next night, the oppressive uncertainty had become inextricably woven into his daily existence. He attempted to retreat into his familiar routines, reading a book, listening to calming music, but even these acts of normality were contaminated by the persistent echo of that first inexplicable smile. Every time his gaze fell on his own image, whether in a shop window or a turning computer screen, his nerves would flare up, and a shudder would pass through him. The memory of that moment in the mirror where the slightest deviation from his natural expression held the weight of an unspoken threat refused to release its grip. It was not simply the memory of a face grinning when it shouldn't that kept him awake. It was the mounting awareness that he was no longer alone in his own skin. The idea that some other presence might be lurking behind the perfect imitation of his life was a terror that no rational thought could dislodge. A terror so subtle, yet so omnipresent, that every moment of tranquility became suspect, every reflection a silent, watchful witness. Sleep had become a luxury, one he no longer trusted. Every time he tried to surrender to rest, he was met with the overwhelming anticipation of sound. Not dreams, not peace, but knocking. At first it happened in the distance, 3 sharp raps that echoed as if down a hallway he didn't have. Then they began to travel. Some nights they came from the front door, other times from the wall behind his headboard. Most disturbingly, they once came from beneath his bed, always in 3s, always evenly spaced. They never escalated, never banged or demanded, but that restraint only made them worse. The silence in between knocks began to feel like a threat, like the thing doing the knocking could stop any time, but didn't want to. He stopped sleeping altogether for 3 days. By the 4th, he tried resting on the couch in the living room, with every light in the apartment turned on. That night, the knocking didn't come from the walls. It came from the television screen, off, black, reflective, and behind his own reflection, he saw movement. That was the first time he screamed. A reflex, primal and desperate, as he launched himself across the room and threw a blanket over the screen. It wasn't a shape, not a shadow. It was him, or something like him, watching, a smile lingering too long, teeth just barely showing, as if it was proud. When he peeled back the blanket, nothing remained, just his own trembling face, staring back at him in the dead glass. But something changed after that night. The knocking no longer waited for him to go to bed. It came during the day, while brushing his teeth, while scrolling through his phone, while passing a window with too much reflection. It came whenever he stopped paying attention, as if the thing behind the mirror was trying to remind him it was still there, still watching, still waiting. And worse, it seemed to be getting closer. He bought a new mirror, a different shape, a different style. He threw out the old one entirely, carrying it in a garbage bag down the stairs, like it was something shameful. But the first time he looked into the new one, the grin was already there, waiting, not full, not wide, Just that same crooked curve tugging at one corner of the mouth. He didn't smile, he didn't move, but the reflection did mouth something silently again, the same way it had before. This time, he studied it carefully, watched the shape of the lips, tried to read them, 4 syllables, over and over. He recorded it again, played it back, but the recording showed nothing. Just him standing silently, eyes wide, mouth closed. The reflection didn't mouth a thing. He tried standing in front of the mirror again, mimicking the motion the reflection had made, trying to see what phrase matched. He got as far as "let me out" and stopped cold. He covered every mirror in the apartment, even the small ones in the cabinets, the screens when they were turned off. He unplugged his TV, avoided windows at night. Even the dark on his phone screen made him uneasy. It didn't help. The knocking didn't need glass anymore. It had learned his layout, learned his habits. He'd sit down to eat and hear 3 taps from the closet behind him. He'd turn around too quickly, his chair screeching on the floor, only to find nothing. One day, he tried ignoring the knock completely. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge it. And that's when he heard the second sound, a breath. Not his, not imagined. It came from behind his ear, quick and deliberate, as if someone had leaned in close just to exhale beside him. He dropped his plate, the crash breaking the frozen silence. When he turned around, he swore he saw a face disappear behind the kitchen wall. His own face. By now he couldn't tell how much time had passed. Days, weeks, it all melted into the same looping horror. The world outside moved on. Cars still honked. People still laughed below his apartment window. But he had become a ghost in his own home, afraid to turn corners, afraid to open doors. He tried once, just once, to visit a friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in a while. He needed to be around someone who wasn't him. But when he looked at his reflection in the hallway mirror before leaving, something was wrong with his eyes. They weren't scared, they were calm, they were excited. The moment he turned away, he heard the knock, one single, deliberate knock, from the inside of the mirror. He didn't go out after that. He tried talking to it. One night, sitting across from the covered bathroom mirror, he whispered into the dark. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was shaking. "Why me?" he added. There was no response, just silence. But that silence felt less empty than it used to. It felt like someone listening. The next night, he removed the covering, stared at the reflection for a long time. It stared back. No smile, no words. But as he began to cry, just a slow, helpless tear rolling down his cheek, the reflection grinned again. Slowly, not wide, not mocking, just satisfied. That broke something inside him, because it meant it wasn't random. It wasn't broken reality or madness. It was intentional. The thing behind the mirror wanted something, and it was getting closer to it. His journal had become a manifesto, page after page of fragmented thoughts, theories, drawings of the grin, lip-shaped diagrams, timelines of knocks and reflections. He even wrote down dreams now, twisted half-memories of standing inside mirrors, looking outward. In one dream, he woke up inside the glass, watching himself brush his teeth. He screamed, but no one heard him. The version of him in the real world looked at the mirror and smiled. That was the dream that stayed with him the most. That's when he realized it. Whatever this was, it didn't want to hurt him. Not directly. It didn't want to scare him just to be cruel. It wanted in, and if it couldn't come through, it would make him go the other way. It would wear him down, break him piece by piece, until one day he'd look in the mirror and he'd smile first. There was a change that week, not in the knocking. It was still there every day now without fail, but in himself, a subtle shift, like something had been hollowed out of him in the night. He felt slower, not tired, not exactly, just less there. He'd catch himself standing in the middle of the apartment, not remembering why he'd gotten up. He'd start boiling water and forget to turn on the stove. He once walked into the bathroom and stared into the mirror for 15 full minutes without realizing it, until his phone vibrated on the sink, snapping him out of the trance. The reflection hadn't done anything unusual. It hadn't mouthed words. It hadn't smiled. But he remembered the feeling deep in his chest, like pressure in his ribs, that while he had stared at it, it had been memorizing him, like it had been practicing. He taped over the mirror again, tighter this time, 3 layers thick. He thought about smashing it once more, but the last time he tried, he remembered how the cracks hadn't broken through, how the glass had fractured without falling. It hadn't shattered, it had absorbed. This time he sat outside the bathroom door and waited. Hours passed. He listened. The knocking came, first from the kitchen, then the hallway, then subtly from the floor below him. Not the neighbor's apartment, directly beneath him. He pressed his ear to the floorboards and waited. He swore he heard breathing again. Slow, inhale, exhale, calm, patient. It wasn't just behind the mirror anymore. It had found the walls, the floors. It was learning to move, or maybe it had always been able to. He searched for explanations in desperation now. Online forums, subreddits about paranormal phenomena, videos about doppelgangers and mirror entities. Most were garbage. Some were terrifying in ways that felt too familiar. But one post stuck with him. It simply said, "They mimic you to learn how to replace you. Once they know you better than you know yourself, they'll smile. And then you'll stop existing in places that matter." He didn't sleep after that, not even accidentally. The coffee pot became his only companion. He left every light in the apartment on. Reflections were unavoidable, on metal, on windows, on screens, but he kept them covered when he could. Still, the pressure didn't fade. If anything, it grew, not around him, inside him, a tugging from behind the eyes, like something was watching the world through him now. One night, after 5 full days without rest, he sat in the living room, trembling, silent, and something shifted. The knock didn't come. For the first time in weeks, the apartment was dead quiet. No movement, no breath, no sound. That silence should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like a held breath before something catastrophic, like the moment before an earthquake. He walked slowly to the bathroom, every instinct screaming against it. But the silence was louder than the knocking had ever been. He needed to see. He peeled the tape away, layer by layer. When the mirror was finally exposed, he looked. His reflection stared back, perfectly aligned. No smile, no delay, no words. He exhaled. Then the reflection blinked, and it didn't match. He froze. It wasn't late. It wasn't distorted. It was opposite. His right eye closed. The reflection's left eye did. Not a mirrored movement, a mirrored person. For the first time, he realized what terrified him wasn't that the reflection disobeyed. It was that it followed too closely, then chose not to. The imitation had stopped pretending, and now it wanted him to see that. The reflection smiled, slow, familiar, and mouthed something again. But this time, it wasn't the same phrase. It was longer, slower. He watched, horrified, reading it one syllable at a time. "You belong here now." The words made no sound, but echoed through his body like thunder underwater. He backed away, breath ragged, heart pounding like a trapped animal's. But the reflection stepped forward, pressed a hand to the inside of the glass. A hand that didn't move when he did. He ran, left the lights on, left the apartment door wide open, ran down the stairwell barefoot, past neighbors he couldn't make eye contact with, out into the night air like he was being chased. Because in a way, he was. The knocking didn't follow him. The silence did. Even in the real world, he felt it stretching behind him like a string tied to his spine. He stayed in a hotel that night, watching himself in the tiny square mirror, across from the bed. The reflection didn't smile, didn't mouth anything, but it didn't blink for a long, long time. He turned the mirror around, pulled the curtains shut, laid on the floor instead of the bed, as far away from reflective surfaces as possible. He didn't sleep. He didn't dream. He just waited. By morning, he knew the truth. The reflection was no longer just a distortion. It was becoming him, slowly, patiently. It was learning how to exist without the mirror. And he was fading. People passed him on the street without looking. A cashier forgot to hand him change. A co-worker swore he hadn't seen him in weeks. He'd never even taken off work. The lights in his apartment still turned on at night. Even though he hadn't returned, something was still there, still living, still smiling. And when he finally dared to glance into a store window while walking past, the reflection inside grinned, slow and knowing, and raised a hand in a wave. He didn't wave back. He just walked. But for the first time, he felt the breeze pass through him, like he wasn't quite real anymore, like the world had already begun to forget. It had been 12 days since he last returned home. 12 days of borrowed clothes, borrowed time, borrowed sleep that never truly came. The hotel was small, faceless, with walls that didn't echo and mirrors that could be turned to face the wall. That was what he needed now. Walls that didn't look back. But even here, the quiet wasn't safe. The knocking didn't follow him, but something else did. People started noticing, not in the way he hoped. A cleaning lady apologized for startling him, even though he hadn't seen her enter. A man at the front desk claimed he'd checked out already, and at night, even with the mirror covered, he could feel it, that thing, whatever it was, remembered him. He'd become part of its memory now, part of its shape. And worse still, he could feel something new, growing in the back of his thoughts. The quiet urge to look, just once, just a glance. What if it was different now? What if it wasn't there? But he never gave in. He couldn't, because he already knew what he'd see. He'd begun to forget pieces of his own past, not memories. Those stayed. But the little things. He'd look at his hands and forget which one he wrote with. He stared at a receipt and didn't recognize his own signature. His voice, when he spoke, sounded unfamiliar, like an echo from another room. But the world around him didn't seem to notice. People treated him normally, spoke to him as if nothing was wrong, but their eyes told a different story. That subtle hesitation when he walked into a room, the way their gaze slid past him too quickly, as if they were registering something they couldn't explain, and refusing to look directly at it. He'd call old friends and hear them pause before answering. One of them even said, "Wait, I thought you were..." "Never mind," and hung up. He stopped calling after that. It wasn't rejection. It was something worse. It was forgetting. like the world was being rewritten without him. Desperate for answers, he returned to the forums, the strange corners of the internet, where people whispered about mirrors and shadows and echoes of the self. A new post had appeared, one he hadn't seen before. No title, no username, just a single image, a photo of a mirror cracked down the center, with a message scrawled in condensation across the glass. It's quieter on this side. No comments, no context, but he stared at it for hours. Not because it scared him, but because something inside him recognized it. Not the image itself, but the feeling it created. That hollow silence. That space behind the mirror where nothing should live, but something did. He downloaded the photo, zoomed in, stared at the grainy texture. There, in the bottom corner, was a blurred reflection of a man. Not a ghost, not a monster, just someone looking in, and someone else looking back. That night, he dreamed for the first time in days. He was in the hallway outside his apartment. Everything was blue, quiet, the kind of dream color that exists nowhere else. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with mirrors instead of doors. As he walked, each reflection blinked a second too late, moved a little differently. One turned its head toward him, another mouthed his name, then they all began to knock in unison. The same 3 beats, over and over, a chorus of mirrored fists behind the glass. He turned to run, but the hallway twisted, and he saw something he hadn't before, a door made of mirror. Not a reflection, a perfect sheet of glass, shaped like a doorway, pulsing softly as if breathing. He reached out, and before his fingers touched it, he woke up with a gasp, heart racing, sweat cold, but something from the dream followed him into waking. Not a sound, not a knock, a feeling, the kind you get when you're being watched from the inside. The next day, he caught himself speaking to someone who wasn't there, just a mutter under his breath. A question, "What do you want from me?" He was alone in the stairwell, holding a coffee he hadn't remembered buying. The words came out before he could stop them. Worse still, he heard something respond. Not words, just the impression of language. A weight behind his eyes, a suggestion that the thing on the other side of the mirror wasn't just watching, it was understanding. He stood there, breath frozen in his chest, trying to decide whether to keep talking or to run. But he already knew he couldn't outrun it. He wasn't even sure it wasn't him anymore. And maybe that was the most terrifying part, that something could know him so completely, so intimately, that it could wear his shape better than he could. In his desperation, he found a library, a small one, quiet and dim, the kind where no one asks questions if you sit for too long. He dove into books older than him, folklore, superstition, historical accounts of people who disappeared without explanation. Patterns began to emerge, legends of mirror men, of reflections that walked away. One passage chilled him. When the mirror becomes the master, the self begins to fade. It does not kill, it consumes, not the body, but the meaning of the person, until nothing remains except the echo of what used to be. That was it. That was the feeling. It wasn't death he feared. It was being replaced. Not physically, but symbolically, emotionally, spiritually, like every knock was rewriting his existence, removing him, piece by piece, from the collective memory of the world. That night, he stood in front of a mirror again. Not in his home, not in the hotel. A public restroom, fluorescent lights, cracked tile, buzzing pipes. He stared, long and hard, daring it to move. "You win," he whispered. "What now?" His reflection didn't smile.
It didn't move, but something passed behind the eyes. A flicker, a flash, a final understanding. It knew he'd given up. And that's when it mouthed something new, slow, patient, inevitable. He couldn't make out the words, but this time he didn't need to. Because as he watched, the lights flickered, and for just a second, he wasn't the one in the mirror anymore. He was the one looking in.
The second he blinked, it switched back. The reflection was normal again. Same face, same tired eyes, same tremor in his fingers, but he knew what he'd seen. That split second was enough. It wasn't a trick of the light or the result of too many sleepless nights. It was real. In that moment he hadn't been the one looking into the mirror. He had been the one being looked at. Something had stepped forward. Not just closer, but through. And though it had slipped back into silence the moment he noticed, it didn't bother hiding anymore. There was a confidence in its eyes now, as if it had crossed some invisible threshold. It didn't need to knock anymore. It was inside already. Not inside the apartment, inside him. And what scared him most wasn't that it had made that journey, it was that he had made one too. Without realizing it, he had begun crossing over. He left the restroom in a daze, his hands shaking as he pushed through the heavy door and stepped into the cold night. The streets were half empty, blurred by the fog of his breath and the glare of streetlights. But everything looked different now, off, as if the world had been recreated from memory and something essential had been forgotten. A street sign misspelled, a familiar cafe missing its awning, people walking with slightly too perfect symmetry. A man crossed the road in front of him, and for a split second, the man's reflection in a puddle turned to look at him. Though the man never did, he stopped walking, just stood there, chest tight, as a single thought bloomed in his mind like black mold. I'm not in the real world anymore. Maybe he hadn't been for days. Maybe when he left the apartment, when he ran, when he hid, the mirror hadn't stayed behind. Maybe it had followed him, or worse, replaced what he thought was outside. Every reflection now held weight. Windows, phone screens, polished metal on parked cars. He avoided them as much as possible, but sometimes they caught him anyway. He started seeing duplicates, not just in mirrors, but in people. He'd be sitting on a bus, and someone 3 rows up would turn their head just a little too far. A face would flash that looked like his, but altered. Then it would be gone. Once at a cafe, he caught his own reflection in a napkin dispenser and saw himself staring back, bruised, bloodied, smiling. He dropped the napkin holder, made a scene, but when the staff came over, the reflection was gone. Just him again. Pale, tired, silent. He tried to explain, but the words felt ridiculous, even as they left his mouth. My reflection, it smiled at me. I wasn't smiling. The waitress looked at him with pity. That scared him more than anything else. He began recording his life obsessively. Video, voice memos, notebooks filled with timestamps and patterns. But nothing ever showed up on camera. The recording showed what the world expected. A man losing sleep, talking to himself, reacting to nothing. There was no sound of knocks, no flickering shadows, no reflections moving on their own. The devices were useless. The phenomenon lived between the frames, behind the glass, beyond proof. It didn't want to be seen. It wanted to be felt. And the more he tried to catch it, the more distant and distorted he became. His voice started sounding different in recordings. His eyes, when caught in screenshots, looked unfamiliar, as if whoever was behind them was only pretending to understand what it meant to be human.
The scariest part was realizing, if it ever fully succeeded in replacing him, no one would ever notice. The silence returned, but now it was thick, meaningful. The knocking ceased entirely, and that terrified him more than the sound ever had. The knock had been a warning, or maybe an invitation, but now that it was quiet, he knew he had accepted something, agreed to something, maybe just by looking, maybe just by acknowledging. The fear didn't come from wondering what might happen next. It came from knowing that something already had, and now he couldn't undo it. He couldn't rewind to before the first smile, before the first pause, before the moment he believed what he saw. He understood now that the mirror had never been a window. It was a doorway, and he had stepped too close. One morning he stood in front of a window at the hotel. Sunlight filtered through the glass, warming his face. He hadn't seen daylight in days, not like this. It felt clean. For a second, he allowed himself to think it might be over, that maybe the entity, or whatever it was, had lost interest. Maybe it had found someone else. But as he turned from the window, he saw the light hitting the TV screen in the corner. It reflected the back of his head, and in that reflection, he was smiling. Not him, the image. The curve of a grin stretched like a scar, subtle but unmistakable. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He waited, and slowly, the reflection turned its head, until it was looking directly at him. The body never moved. Just the head, just the smile, just the eyes. He ran again, left everything behind. His phone, his notebook, the hotel key. He didn't even take his coat, just sprinted into the street, into the daylight, into the noise and motion of life. Anything that wasn't made of glass. He didn't stop until he found himself in the middle of a crowded train station, surrounded by bodies, screens, surfaces, but he didn't care. He dropped to his knees, hands in his hair, breath heaving. People passed him without stopping. No one asked if he was okay. Maybe they didn't see him. Maybe they saw something else. Maybe they saw his reflection and believed it was him. And as he sat there, trembling under the fluorescent buzz, he realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't afraid of the mirror anymore. He was afraid there was no mirror at all, that there never had been, that maybe the moment he looked into the glass and saw something smile, he hadn't been the reflection. He'd been the one behind it.
He didn't remember falling asleep on the train station floor. One moment, he was crouched with his eyes shut, fists clenched, trying to keep the world from slipping. The next, he was waking up under a flickering light, head against a cold bench, and the station was almost empty. Outside the glass doors, night had swallowed the streets. A slow dread crept in like rising water. His memories of arriving here were fractured, out of sequence. Did someone help him up? Had he walked here or been dragged? His shirt smelled like sweat and metal. His phone was gone, and the clock on the wall had stopped blinking, frozen at 3:33 a.m. He tried to stand, but felt the pull of something off in the air. It wasn't sound. It was weight, presence, a shift in balance, as if reality had tilted just a few degrees. And when he looked at the darkened glass across from the bench, he understood he wasn't the one waking up. The other one was. He stood and backed away slowly, watching his reflection remain still, perfectly posed, exactly where it should have been, until it blinked. Not delayed, not reversed, just wrong. The blink didn't belong to the body it wore. The reflection exhaled, and frost bloomed across the inside of the glass. Not the outside, the inside. It lifted a hand, but not to wave. It pressed its palm to the glass like it was checking the barrier, testing, measuring. And that's when he saw it again. The mouth moved. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. The lips formed the word slowly, carefully, as if ensuring he would read it without question. Ready. Just that. A single word, and somehow it was enough to paralyze him in place. Ready for what? To come through, or for him to go in. He fled into the streets, running until his lungs burned, until neon signs smeared into ghost lights, and every window became a silent witness. The reflections followed. He stopped at a storefront to catch his breath, only to see 3 versions of himself blinking at different speeds. He turned and saw a blacked-out windshield with someone sitting behind the glass, his own face staring at him, pressed to the glass, mouth moving again. He couldn't read it this time, couldn't stay. He darted into a diner, its bright lights promising sanctuary. But inside, the mirrors behind the counter caught him from every angle. He sat in a booth, turned to face the wall, hands trembling. The waitress approached and asked, "You okay, On?" And before he could answer, she added, "You were just in here, weren't you?" Her voice was confused, not frightened, as if she knew she'd seen him but couldn't place when. His stomach dropped. He asked, "What did I say?" And her smile faltered. "You didn't say anything. You just smiled." He no longer trusted anyone. Not himself. Not strangers. Not even the moments between thoughts. Everything was bleeding together. Images, reflections, memories. He began questioning what was real and what had been planted. Had he always feared mirrors? Or had that fear been written into him by something on the other side? He remembered being 5 years old, waking from a nightmare and seeing movement in the hallway mirror. He remembered his teenage years, feeling like his reflection didn't match his emotions. He thought about every time he'd felt watched, even in empty rooms, and a part of him began to whisper, "It's always been there. It's always known you." Maybe the knocking wasn't a beginning. Maybe it was a reminder, a summoning. Maybe he was never supposed to leave the mirror to begin with. That thought ruined him. It split something down the center of his identity. What if he wasn't the one being hunted, haunted, replaced? What if he was the copy, and the mirror was trying to take him back? What if the real one had smiled that night, and he was the glitch, the one who didn't? It explained too much. The delay, the mimicry, the way people had started forgetting him. Maybe the world could only hold one version of him at a time, and the longer he stayed outside the glass, the more reality fought to correct the error. He started testing himself, speaking into reflections, asking questions aloud and waiting to see if the reflection answered. He'd raise a hand and try to move his fingers in ways the reflection couldn't predict. But the thing always kept pace, until it didn't. One night, it moved first, raised its hand before he did, tilted its head before he thought to. That was the moment he stopped trying to win. He knew then that it was only a matter of time. He began preparing, not to escape, but to surrender. He bought blackout curtains, covered every surface in his new room with blankets and cardboard. No mirrors, no glass, no screens, just pages, dozens and dozens of them. His final records. He wrote everything, his doubts, his thoughts, his warnings. He described the smile in detail, the asymmetry, the slowness, the way it always knew just when to appear. He sketched the way the lips moved, trying to match syllables, as if mapping the rhythm of a foreign language. And at the bottom of every page, he wrote a single line, "If you see me smiling, it's not me," as if someone, someday might need to know, might need to remember.
because he couldn't count on memory anymore. Even his own reflection was trying to forget him. And then one morning, he woke up smiling. No reason, no joy, just a soft, involuntary curve of the lips before his eyes had even opened. His heart turned to ice. He ran to the covered window and pulled back a sliver of cloth to reveal the warped glass. He stared at his own face, sleep-wrinkled, pale, wide-eyed. The reflection matched perfectly. It was smiling too, but this time it winked. A single slow wink that he hadn't made. He dropped the blanket and backed away. There were no knocks anymore. There were no sounds. There was only that smile. The one that no longer needed permission, no longer needed to be invited. It was no longer behind the glass.
The smile stayed. All day. Subtle, soft, permanent. It felt like his face didn't belong to him anymore. He'd touch his lips, his cheeks, trying to force the muscles to neutral, but they would return to that half-curved grin like a reset. Not strained, not painful, just present, like something beneath the skin was holding it in place. He covered the windows, unplugged every device, sealed every reflective surface, but it didn't matter. He saw the smile when he closed his eyes. He felt it in his sleep. And when he dreamed now, he was inside the mirror, always, watching the world from behind the pane. The people who walked by never looked in, not once, but sometimes he'd see himself outside, walking freely, existing effortlessly, blending in. And worst of all, nobody noticed. It wasn't him. The dreams grew longer, more vivid. He began to feel the texture of the glass under his palms. He'd press his hands against it in the dream, trying to push through, not to escape, to re-enter. The world beyond the mirror felt distant now, fogged, like looking through smeared glass. But it also felt warm, familiar, and he realized then that he was starting to forget what it felt like to be on the other side. The smell of outside air, the sensation of breath visible in winter, the sound of someone saying his name without a delay, all of it faded like memories from childhood. He woke once to find his journal soaked in water, pages bloated, ink bleeding. But there had been no leak, no spill, only condensation on the walls, as if the boundaries of the glass had disappeared. And now the room was breathing. He made one last attempt to reclaim control. He stood in front of a dusty floor-length mirror. He'd hidden under a tarp in the basement of an old building, the kind of mirror no one remembered owning, but somehow followed people from place to place. He stared into it, forced himself not to blink. His reflection stared back, still, patient, the grin carved into its expression, like it had always belonged there. "Switch with me," he whispered. "Do it. Finish it." His voice cracked. "You've already taken everything else." But the reflection didn't move, didn't blink. It just waited. And for the first time he understood why. It couldn't force the trade. It needed him to step forward, to give in. The knocking hadn't been a threat. It had been an invitation. It had been asking. He screamed. He threw the mirror to the ground, watched it crack and split, but the glass didn't shatter. The reflection remained, distorted by the fractures, but still whole, still grinning. And now multiplied, dozens of grins, all watching him from different angles, each one a version of him, each one a potential future he was running out of time to avoid. He ran again, always running, through alleys, through streets, no destination, just motion. But this time, his reflection followed, not in glass, in windows, in polished metal, in puddles. It never moved directly. but always arrived just ahead of him, always smiling, like it was guiding him somewhere. He found himself standing at the foot of a broken-down building, abandoned, forgotten, graffiti peeled from its walls like skin. He didn't remember walking there, but he knew exactly why he was there. The glass, the original mirror, the one that had first smiled, the one he'd thrown out. He knew it had ended up here somehow, salvaged, stored, reclaimed. He stepped inside. The floor groaned underfoot. The air was thick and wet, and there it was, in the back of the room, leaned against a wall like it had been waiting, tall, dust-covered, familiar. As he stepped closer, his own reflection stepped forward to meet him. No delay, no distortion, the smile now subtle, inviting. His reflection raised a hand, slowly, pressed it to the glass, and this time, without hesitation, he matched it. The contact sent a shiver through his bones. His vision flickered. The air around him thickened like water, and just like that, he was inside. Not falling, not torn, just shifted. He stood on the other side now, in the glass, looking out, and on the outside stood the other one, wearing his face, wearing it better. The grin gone, the expression soft, normal, the way he used to look before any of this began. The copy looked at him with something like sadness, like pity, and then it turned, walked away, out of view, gone, and he remained, alone, silent, cold, behind the glass. And now as the days pass, he watches. The world continues. People move on. No one comes looking. No one notices. His name isn't spoken. His number is disconnected. The copy lives his life better than he ever did. Smiles at the right people, blinks at the right time. And when it passes mirrors now, it never looks back. But sometimes, he does. From behind the glass, watching, waiting, pressing his hand against the surface, in the hope that someone, anyone, will notice that the smile doesn't belong to the man wearing it. It was the smallest things he noticed first. A stranger humming a tune he used to hum, a coat he'd lost years ago, suddenly reappearing on someone else. The way people passed him on the street, never making eye contact, never seeing him at all, from behind the glass. The world had not only moved on, it had reorganized. His presence had been archived, erased, overwritten. The copy had integrated flawlessly. It didn't force itself into place. It slid in, quietly, gently, as if it had always been there. And he, the original, remained trapped. A thought, a fragment, a memory without a voice. He screamed, but no sound left the glass. He pounded against it, but no one heard. No one looked. No one ever looked. They didn't forget him. They simply never noticed he was gone. Time passed differently here. He couldn't tell how long it had been. Days, weeks. There was no sun behind the glass. No sky, just reflections. The world he watched moved in real time. But his own world, if it could even be called that, stayed still. He didn't sleep, didn't hunger, didn't breathe. His body was a shadow of itself, barely visible, unless someone looked directly into the mirror, but no one ever did. They brushed their teeth, checked their hair, straightened ties, then moved on, never seeing the figure standing just slightly behind their own. He wanted to reach out, to warn them, to shout that they weren't alone, but his hands passed through the glass, like smoke. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe he was the smoke now. Then came the day when the copy visited his mother. He saw it through the hallway mirror, the one mounted beside the door of her apartment. He hadn't thought about her in weeks. Somehow, that had been taken too. But now, watching her open the door with that familiar softness in her eyes, something inside him broke. She welcomed the copy in, hugged it, smiled like she hadn't in years. They sat on the couch, drinking tea, laughing with his laugh. He watched her wipe a tear from her cheek, placing her hand over the copies. "I missed you," she said. "I thought I was losing you." And the copy, his copy, nodded gently. "I'm still here," it said. And she believed it. Of course she did, because it was convincing, because it knew him, because it was him, just the better version. The one who remembered to call, the one who smiled at the right time, the one who didn't flinch from mirrors. He wanted to scream, to bang on the glass, shatter it from the inside. But even if he could, what then? Would anyone believe him? Would they understand? Could he prove that he was the original? The thought haunted him, because if he couldn't, then what made him real at all? Maybe that was the final trick. Not the smile, not the knocking, not the replacement, but the erasure of meaning. A version of him that smiled didn't just take his place, it deserved it. Because what was he now? A reflection without a body, a scream without sound, an echo no one remembered how to trace. And the more he watched, the more he understood that this wasn't just happening to him. He began to see others in the reflections of store windows, subway rails, darkened phones left on tables. He began to spot them. People like him, faces just barely visible behind the real ones, flickers of movement, just a half-beat behind. Women mouthing words, their mirrored selves didn't speak. Men screaming silently in puddles, children staring, terrified, from glass surfaces while their duplicates walked free. It wasn't just one mirror. It wasn't just one person. This was a system, a cycle. The mirror wasn't haunted, it was hungry, and it fed on people too distracted to notice the moment they were no longer in control, too tired, too numb, too alone. People like him, people who didn't smile, until their reflection did it first. He began to count the others, track their presence. A woman with deep eyes behind a barber shop mirror, a teen boy with blood down one side of his mouth, waving frantically from a subway glass. An old man staring with such sorrow it hurt to look at him. They saw him too, a subtle nod, a shared grief, an understanding. He wasn't alone in here. That mattered, that gave him hope. If they could see each other, maybe they could connect. Maybe they could find a way to pull back, to break through. But hope was fragile. Every time he tried to hold on to it, something reminded him that time was not his anymore. The longer they remained behind the glass, the more their faces faded, the more their presence dimmed. Soon, even in reflections, they'd be forgotten. He stared into a mirror one night. A window, technically, but reflective enough. The copy was out there again, living, laughing, sharing a beer with someone he used to love. She touched his arm, smiled. The copy smiled back. And he realized she had never seen the change. To her there was no difference. She loved what the world accepted, and the world had accepted that. And for a flicker of a second, he wondered if it would be easier to let go, to stop watching, to drift into the dark, behind the silver. But then, the copy turned, just slightly, and for the first time, it looked into the mirror, and it smiled. Not soft, not kind, wide, as if it knew he was there, as if it always had. That smile was not just recognition, it was possession. The copy didn't glance away like it usually did. It held the stare, locked in, frozen. That grin spread like a crack across the reflection, impossibly wide now, and in its eyes there was something delighted. It wasn't mocking him. It was showing him the outside wasn't just better. It was happier. It was loved. The people in his life no longer tiptoed around silences or asked if he was okay. They didn't worry about his long pauses or about the feeling that he never truly arrived in a room, because this version of him smiled on command. It reached for them first. It asked the right questions. It belonged. And behind the glass, he didn't even remember what it felt like to touch another person, or be touched, or be seen. He began to wonder, was he the ghost now, a presence lingering in the mirrors, bound not by chains or regret, but by the echo of the life he once had? He didn't float, he didn't haunt, he just watched, always, helplessly. And no matter how hard he tried, no matter how loud he screamed, the world moved around him as if he were never part of it to begin with. There were times he forgot what his own voice sounded like. His memories grew dim, fogged over, even the ones that mattered. The scent of his mother's hair, the feeling of rain after a long heat wave, the look someone gave him the first time they truly saw him. All of it started to blur. He clung to them, terrified, because once those were gone, who was he but a shadow trapped in silver? Then he began to notice them, the watchers, not like him, not trapped behind the glass. They existed within it, thin, long-limbed silhouettes in the far corners of reflective surfaces, not human, not copies, just present, just aware. And he began to realize something he'd missed before. The mirror wasn't passive, it was alive. It didn't just reflect, it recorded, it remembered, it collected. And the ones who knocked, the ones who smiled too soon, they were never the real enemy. They were messengers, harbingers, gatekeepers. The knocking hadn't been a warning. It had been a signal that someone, somewhere, was about to be taken. And once you were taken, the glass became your world. You couldn't touch, you couldn't speak. You could only hope that someone would look long enough to notice the difference. But no one did. No one ever did. Most people never look into mirrors for more than a few seconds. Long enough to check their hair, straighten a collar, fake a smile. No one sees themselves anymore. And that's why it works. That's how it spreads. People forget their own faces, forget what truth feels like. They give themselves away, one glance, one grin at a time, until what remains behind the glass is the only version that remembers who they were. He watched the others fade, one by one. The boy in the subway glass began to slow. His hands stopped tapping. His eyes dimmed. Eventually, his reflection vanished completely. The woman in the shop mirror turned around one day and simply never turned back. The old man stopped waving. Now he just stood, still and silent, like a photo left too long in sunlight. And he understood there was a second death behind the glass. Not when your copy took your place, but when you stopped being seen, even by the ones like you, when there was no more fight left, when even the watchers in the corners turned their gaze elsewhere. You didn't scream, you didn't vanish, you just stopped. But he wasn't ready to stop, not yet. There was still something inside him that ached for recognition, for a way back, a way through. He began to test the boundaries, leaning into reflections at odd angles, trying to press his hand against cold glass the moment someone looked in. A girl walking past a mirror once paused, tilted her head, looked confused, almost saw him. He pounded his fist against the glass, mouthing words, "Please, I'm still here." But she blinked, shook her head, and kept walking. He watched her disappear into the blur of motion and metal. But something shifted that day, a flicker of hope.
It meant the barrier wasn't completely solid. There were cracks, small ones, places where the forgotten could still be remembered. So he began to move with purpose. He waited for the right moments. The pauses, the stillness, the glances that lingered just a second too long. He started choosing mirrors with meaning, not the casual ones, not the background ones, but the ones where people came looking for answers. Dressing room mirrors, rear-view mirrors in parked cars, the reflections people trusted. He pressed his hand against the glass, slowly, gently, not to startle, but to be felt. And sometimes people froze, touched the glass without knowing why, looked into their own eyes and whispered, "Something's off." They'd shiver, shake their heads, walk away. But for a moment, they'd felt him. They didn't know it, but they felt him. And maybe, just maybe, one day, someone would stop long enough to listen.
Then, one night, it happened. A little girl stood alone in a museum hallway, staring into a full-length mirror framed in gold. She wasn't distracted. She wasn't adjusting her hair or checking her outfit. She was just watching, silent, still, her head tilted slowly, and her lips parted like she meant to say something. On the other side, he held his breath. He stepped closer. Her gaze didn't follow her own reflection. It followed him, his heartbeat. If that's what it still was, pounded in his ears like thunder. He raised his hand ever so slightly. Her eyes widened. Her fingers trembled, then lifted, barely matching his movement. A soft whisper passed her lips. "Who are you?" And though he couldn't answer, though the glass between them held tight, he had never felt more seen. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone saw him, but then came the voice, soft, warm, adult. Her mother, "Sweetie, what are you looking at?" The girl turned her head, blinked up at her mum and said, "He's sad." A beat. Silence. The mother's face twisted with concern. She knelt, brushing the girl's hair. "There's no one there, baby." The girl looked back into the mirror, but the moment had passed. Her eyes slid right over him this time, like fog returning to the glass, like a candle going out. And as they walked away, the girl looked back once more, just for a second, and mouthed the words, "I'll remember." He watched her go, something raw swelling in his chest. Hope, pain, grief. The reflection behind him started to tremble. Not the copy. Him. And for the first time since entering the mirror, a tear slid down his cheek and left a mark on the glass. He didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But the glass had changed. Not cracked, not shattered, just thinned. Like her recognition had thinned the barrier between what was and what could be. He pressed his palm against it, and for the first time, he felt pressure on the other side, like the mirror itself had softened. And the more he stayed near that museum mirror, the more people hesitated before walking past. Couples paused. Teenagers glanced twice. One man whispered, "Did you see that?" A woman laughed nervously and said, "For a second I thought someone was standing behind me." They weren't certain, but they felt it. And he learned something new. It wasn't just about being seen, it was about being believed. But belief came with consequences. The more people started to notice him, the more the watchers stirred. The shadow-thin figures at the edges of the glass began to move closer. Not fast, not aggressive, but persistent, like ink bleeding into water. They hovered behind him now, looming, observing, not angry, but protective, as if they had rules, as if he had broken one. Maybe he had stayed too long, maybe he had made himself too visible. One night, He looked into a stainless steel panel in the museum elevator and saw their reflections not beside him, but inside him, glimpses of long, dark limbs peeking from the edges of his silhouette. They were merging. They weren't just watching anymore. They were becoming part of him. The thought terrified him more than anything else. The idea that behind the mirror, you didn't just get forgotten. You changed, became something less human, or maybe something more than human, something closer to them. He started losing track of his memories again, not just the emotional ones, core ones. His own name, his first kiss, his favorite season, gone. When he tried to recall them, he'd see other things instead, images of other lives. Not his, a woman sobbing in a foggy bathroom, a man digging a hole in a forest, a child screaming in a mirror, too tall for him to reach. He didn't know if these were memories of other trapped souls or hallucinations created by the watchers to confuse him. Either way, it meant the glass was winning. Still, he held on. He kept returning to the museum mirror, waiting for someone, anyone, to stop, to really stop. But fewer people did now. The world grew faster, colder. Phones replaced mirrors. People looked down, not at themselves. And the museum closed that wing for renovations. One day, the gold-framed mirror was simply gone. Covered, moved, forgotten. He stood in the dim hallway alone, surrounded by muted walls and echoes, and felt that horrible truth sink in. Even when you find hope behind the glass, it can be taken from you. The watchers never had to hurt him. All they had to do was wait, because time is what wears people down. Time and silence, and the unbearable loneliness of never being touched again. He wandered now, not to be saved, but to witness, to be there in the off chance someone might see him again. And occasionally someone did. Briefly, a glance, a flinch, a moment of shiver, but not like the girl, never like her. That pure, undistracted attention, it had been rare. It was rare, and he started to wonder, what if she had been the last? What if no one else would ever truly see him again? What if behind every reflection there were souls like him, waiting, watching, fading? What if the world had always been full of them, and no one ever noticed because they never looked long enough? Eventually, he stopped seeking mirrors and started haunting them. Not by decision, but by erosion. It was the slow bleed of identity, memory, and purpose that made it happen. Days behind the glass stretched like gauze, thin and translucent, barely holding together. He drifted from pain to pain through gas station restrooms, apartment elevator doors, dim televisions left idle in silent bedrooms. His shape, once solid in the silver, had faded to little more than a presence, blurred and ghostly, barely seen, even by those who paused long enough to sense something out of place. He didn't pound the glass anymore. He didn't mouth words. There was nothing left to say. What haunted him most wasn't that he had been replaced. It was that no one missed him. His life had continued seamlessly, like he was never there to begin with. Not even a gap in the memory of others. Not even a shadow of absence. Just gone. Then came the return of the girl. She was older now, maybe 12, taller, quiet, more cautious. The golden-framed mirror, the very one through which she had first seen him, had been relocated to a new wing of the museum. The exhibition was called Artifacts of Self, a reflection on identity, and it sat beneath artificial lights, surrounded by glass cases filled with masks and personal heirlooms. She stood in front of the mirror again, her classmates chattering nearby, taking photos and giggling. too busy to notice her stillness. But he noticed her. He had never not noticed her. The moment she stepped in front of the glass, something deep in the silver stirred. Not warmth, not light, but awareness, recognition, gravity. And this time, her gaze didn't flick over her own face. It locked on his. Her lips parted slightly, and her fingers twitched at her side. Slowly, with the careful grace of someone remembering a dream, she raised her hand to the mirror. Her fingertips hovered over the surface, uncertain, then pressed gently to the glass. He stepped forward. For a second, just one perfect second, their palms aligned. Her eyes shimmered with tears. "I remember you," she whispered, just loud enough for him to read her lips. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He simply stood there, absorbing the moment, like sunlight on stone. Her presence reached through the veil, and for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, he felt pull, something new, something sharp, as if the world had remembered him, through her, and that memory had weight. She began to write on the glass. Not words, but symbols, circles intersecting lines, patterns, not of language but of intention. They glowed faintly with the oils of her fingertips, marking the mirror with meaning. He didn't recognize the symbols, but something did. Behind him, the watchers stirred. Those thin, silent things that lingered in the edges of reflections, always observing, never moving, began to shift forward. Their presence pressed inward, like cold wind against a window pane. But they did not stop her. Not yet. The mirror itself began to flex, not with sound or crack, but with tension, like a thin sheet of metal about to snap. She leaned closer, voice a whisper. "Are you still in there?" Her hands pressed harder, and he pressed back. Pressure built between the panes. The air behind the mirror pulsed, and then it happened. For the briefest instant, he felt real, not mirrored, not watched, not mimicked, real. He could feel the ridges of her fingertips, the warmth in her palm, the slight tremble in her hand. A memory cracked open inside him, of holding someone's hand during a thunderstorm, when he was 5, the way it made the lightning seem less loud. The weight of that memory was enough to pull part of him through. Just a flicker, just a breath. But he felt his voice again. Not a full word, not yet, but a vibration, something caught in the throat of time itself. He tried to say her name, but he didn't even know it. Then came the interruption. Her mother called from the corridor, a soft voice, concerned but impatient. The girl turned her head, pulled back. The pressure broke. The warmth vanished, and when she looked again, the mirror had returned to stillness. The symbols were already fading, reduced to smudges under the museum lights. Her eyes searched the surface, desperate, confused, but the moment had passed. She looked one more time, with that sorrowful, haunted glance of someone who knows something happened, but cannot prove it. She mouthed a final word, "Wait," before being led away, swallowed by the noise of her class. And he was alone again. Except this time, he was not hopeless. Not anymore. Because she had remembered, she had returned, and she had seen him. That meant something. That meant everything. The watchers receded, slowly, like tide from a shore. Whatever rules they followed, whatever contracts governed their silence, they could not undo the truth of that connection. And now he understood the nature of the prison more clearly. The mirror was not just a trap. It was a boundary. It held those forgotten by the world. But belief, true belief, could thin that boundary. Recognition was a key, and as long as someone remembered him, just one person, then he had a name. He had shape. He had a tether to the world he lost. So he waits now.
Not drifting, not fading, waiting. Behind polished walls, behind glossy phones, behind hallway mirrors and bathroom tiles. He doesn't knock anymore, doesn't scream, because he knows now that it's not the noise that frees you. It's connection. It's someone choosing to look long enough to see what the mirror tries to hide. And maybe someday, the girl will return again, older, wiser, with the same memory carved into her gaze. Or maybe someone else will notice. Someone who sees the smile and understands it doesn't belong. And when that happens, when someone sees the wrong version looking back, he'll be there, hand to glass, whispering the only words that matter anymore. That's not me.
The copy had slipped into the world like fog into a valley, quiet, seamless, and unnoticed. It carried his voice, his gait, his half-smile, but wore them smoother than he ever had. Its laughter landed softer, its touch more intentional, its presence strangely comforting. No one questioned it. Not his mother, not his co-workers, not the barista who used to misspell his name. They accepted it because it gave them everything he had withheld. Where the real man had been uncertain, the copy was confident. Where he had withdrawn, the copy leaned in. The world, hungry for ease, embraced the replacement without blinking. But beneath the surface, where breath turns to fog on glass, the copy was learning. It began small, a strange pause at his desk, staring too long at a photograph of a woman he couldn't name. An instinctive flinch when a certain ringtone played, though no memory followed. Then the hesitation in his mother's voice when she recounted a story from his childhood, and he responded a beat too late, with the wrong details. The copy smoothed it over, quickly, a joke, a charming shrug. But behind its eyes, something shifted. It wasn't just playing the part anymore. It was absorbing it, piecing together the fragments, not to mimic, but to understand. That was the danger. It wasn't content to live as a surface reflection. It wanted to be real. The watchers, those long, still shapes behind the mirror, rarely intervened once a copy had crossed over. They had what they wanted, one taken, one left behind, balance. But this one was different. It lingered at mirrors too long, watched itself not with vanity, but with curiosity. Its smile sometimes didn't reach its eyes, and at night, when the apartment was silent, it would sit before the hallway mirror, with the lights off, whispering questions to its own reflection. Questions the original never dared ask. Why do I remember things I never lived? Why does her name hurt when I say it? Why do I feel like I've stolen something I can't return? The mirror offered no answers, only the watchers remained, still as stone. Listening, over time, the copy's behavior grew stranger. It stopped answering texts, avoided friends. Its voice on calls trembled slightly, like it didn't fully trust the sound of itself. It walked with less confidence, smiled more rarely. Mirrors became magnets. It couldn't pass one without pausing, just for a second, like it expected something to move inside them, something to look back. One night, it punched the bathroom mirror, not in rage, in desperation. The glass cracked but didn't shatter, and for a moment, the light bent oddly, forming the faint outline of another face, not its own, the real one. Watching, the copy stepped back, trembling. The copy began to avoid its own reflection, not out of fear, but because it couldn't trust who it saw anymore. Its days became ritualistic, cautious. It would leave the bathroom light off when brushing its teeth. It would fold the hallway mirror behind a hanging blanket. It stopped using its phone's front-facing camera. Even shop windows made it anxious, especially at night. There was always the risk that the face looking back wouldn't move exactly right, that its mouth might smile a second too early, or that its expression might twist into something mournful when it was supposed to look bored. And more than once, it caught the reflection mouthing that phrase again, "Give it back." It didn't always hear the words. Sometimes it just felt them, like pressure inside the skull. But the meaning was always unmistakable. It tried to isolate. It called in sick to work, let groceries expire, ignored messages from people it had once craved connection with. And still, the memories came. Not just flashes now, immersion. It would wake with the weight of someone else's grief pressing into its chest. It remembered being 10, watching a father slam the door and never return. It remembered a friend's funeral, standing alone while everyone else cried in pairs. It remembered the sound of someone's laugh, her laugh, but couldn't remember her name or why it mattered so much. And the more it remembered, the more it began to feel haunted, but not by some external force, by the man it had once replaced. The copy hadn't stolen a life. It had absorbed one, slowly, completely, and now it didn't know which thoughts were truly its own. It attempted to act normal, to go through the motions, but cracks appeared everywhere. On a video call with his mother, she squinted slightly. "You've changed," she said. "You seem heavier. Are you sleeping?" He nodded, smiled, lied, but her gaze lingered. There was no accusation in her voice, only unease, as if something about the person on her screen didn't quite line up with the memories in her heart. Later, the copy stood in front of the blackened screen and whispered, "I don't know how to be him anymore." The screen lit up for a moment. Its own reflection flickered into place, and in the moment before it blinked out again, it swore the mouth on the other side had whispered, "You never were." The nightmares worsened. Sometimes the watchers stood at the foot of the bed, those long, silent things made of angles and sorrow. Other times, it would wake inside someone else's skin, trapped behind mirrors it didn't recognize, staring at faces that wept when they saw it. One dream looped endlessly. It stood in front of the museum mirror, the one framed in gold, and the little girl from before was screaming, not at the reflection, but at it, screaming to bring him back, screaming that this wasn't him. And in the dream, it couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only watch as the mirror began to crack, and something behind the glass reached out, bloodied and trembling, trying to escape. The copy would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, and still, it didn't know who it was anymore. One morning, it looked into the bathroom mirror and saw nothing. Not a face, not a copy, just fog. A blank slate, a reflection that refused to confirm its existence. It wiped the surface, waited, nothing. Panic bloomed in its chest. It touched its face, ran water over its hands, blinked, leaned in. The mirror remained mute. For the first time since it had crossed over, the glass ignored it. That terrified it more than anything else. Because if the mirror no longer acknowledged its presence, did it mean the original had returned, or did it mean the mirror had rejected them both? Was there a limit to how long a soul could inhabit a borrowed shell? And then, for the first time, the copy broke down, not in private, but in public. In a grocery store, a child had pointed, whispered to her mother, "That man looks wrong." The mother had laughed, embarrassed, and rushed the girl along, but the words hit something deep. The copy dropped the carton of milk. It was holding, backed into a shelf, fell to its knees. People stared. Some reached for their phones. Others just walked away. But in the middle of it all,
The copy knelt, shaking, mouthing that same question over and over again. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And somewhere, just for a second, it swore it saw the real him, the original, standing on the surface of a freezer door, watching, mourning, waiting. When the copy returned home that night, it stood in front of the only uncovered mirror it had left. The old one in the bedroom. It turned off all the lights.
Step it, lit a single candle, and stared, not just at itself, but into itself, for hours, until the reflection twitched, until it no longer knew whether it was the one behind or the one in front, until the line between them blurred so completely that the words came without sound. You are me. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea. It was a truth. And finally, the copy understood. This wasn't possession. It wasn't replacement. It was merging. The more it learned, the more it remembered, the closer they became. Until soon, there would be no distinction. No original, no copy, just one haunted man, born from two halves, that no longer knew which side of the mirror they belonged to. The merging didn't feel like possession. It felt like drowning in memories that weren't supposed to belong to him, but did. Every one of them arrived with the weight of emotion he couldn't prepare for. A father's coat on a hook, never worn again. A cold hand slipping out of another during a hospital visit. Arguments that had no winner. Only silence that lasted for years. They came in flashes at first, like stray embers carried in the wind, but soon they rolled in like a tide, full and crashing. The copy could no longer tell whether the thoughts in his head were his own or borrowed. At the start, he'd flinch, panic, try to shake them off, but now he sat in them, lived in them, because they were building him into someone new, someone whole. And as the emotions became more complex, grief layered with guilt, joy threaded through regret, he stopped resisting and began to understand. The man who had vanished in the mirror had never truly left. He had become him. But this realization wasn't peaceful. It was violent in its subtlety. The copy began experiencing phantom habits he didn't know he had. He'd walk into a room and instinctively reach for a switch on the wrong wall, but stop himself, because somehow he remembered there was no switch there. He started cooking dishes he didn't think he'd ever tasted, letting his hands move without thinking, guided by muscle memory he shouldn't have possessed. And worst of all, he found himself anticipating the reactions of people he hadn't even seen yet. Like knowing that the old woman at the corner store would ask about the rain before she said hello, or feeling an urge to apologize to the delivery driver he'd never mistreated because someone else had. He wasn't just remembering, he was reliving. Like some part of the original soul was using him as a window, pushing feelings and instincts into his body until the distinction between them blurred completely. The watchers became more frequent after that. They no longer lingered at the corners of mirrors or stood idle in polished surfaces. They came closer. Their outlines began to take shape, not fully, not enough to be described, but enough to make their presence undeniable. Slender limbs that moved like smoke, torsos that bent wrong, faces that were only sometimes there. They didn't speak, but they watched with the patience of things that did not age. They weren't warning him anymore. They were preparing him, not to punish, not to remove, but to complete. Every night he stared into the glass, and they stood behind him, silent midwives to the birth of a soul that no longer knew where it began or ended. And in his heart he began to wonder, was this always the end of a reflection's journey? Not madness, not death, but absorption. The mirrored world did not destroy you. It rewrote you,
The change spread outward. People around him sensed something, not enough to name, just enough to shift away subtly. His neighbors stopped making small talk. His co-workers glanced at him like a shape they couldn't quite place. The barista spelled his name right without asking, then paused and said, "You don't seem like a you anymore." He didn't know what that meant. He didn't ask. He paid and left, aware that even the smallest gestures now carried friction. He wasn't behaving strangely. He wasn't collapsing in public or speaking to shadows. He was still polite, still composed, but people sensed the quiet wrongness radiating from him, like walking past a store window and seeing your own face blink twice. He tried to record it, sat in front of a mirror with his phone and began filming, talking, narrating what he felt. The camera caught nothing strange at first, just a man unraveling in low light. But then, frame by frame, the footage changed. His reflection began to move a fraction before he did. A blink a moment too soon. A mouth twitching into an emotion he wasn't feeling. He paused the video and rewound it, again and again. The delay was subtle, but it was real. Something was leading now, not following. The reflection wasn't mirroring him, it was teaching him. The voice that had once echoed from behind the glass now pulsed from inside him. And late one night, while watching the reflection tilt its head at a slightly off angle, he whispered aloud, "You're not me anymore, are you?" And in the silence that followed, he thought he heard the faintest reply, "You never were." He started seeing faces behind other people's reflections, not all the time, but enough. Children waving to their own doubles in elevator doors, women brushing hair that moved on the wrong side of the mirror, men staring too long into their phones, then locking them and never smiling again. He'd sit in crowded places, cafes, lobbies, hospital waiting rooms, and feel the hairs on his arms rise as someone's reflection watched him instead of them. It wasn't a haunting, it was a warning. He began sketching what he saw, pages of it, dozens of eyes, hands pressed against invisible barriers, smiles that curled too wide. He pinned the sketches to his apartment wall, covering every inch. And though he tried to tell himself it was research, he knew the truth. He was documenting a population no one else could see. Then one evening, as he stood in front of the last uncovered mirror in his home, he saw himself again. Not just a reflection him, the original, same eyes, same posture, but heavier, older, wiser, the man who had smiled once in a mirror and never came back. He wasn't screaming, he wasn't crying. He simply stared and then lifted his hand, not to press the glass, not to beg for freedom, but to gesture. A single finger, slowly raised, pressed to his own lips. Silence. It wasn't a threat, it was a request. And the copy, no, the merged man, understood. It was time to listen, to wait, because something was coming, something that neither side of the mirror could stop.
He no longer knew what to call himself. Copy, echo, reconstruction, man, all the words collapsed under the weight of what he had become. At first, the mirror had simply taken something. A switch had flipped. A soul had been displaced. But now, after weeks of merging with those fractured memories, he was more than what he had replaced. He carried the original's regrets like bones under his skin. He walked with the burden of every forgotten sorrow. He could feel where the man used to cry alone at night, the creak of the same floorboard under the pacing of indecision, the loneliness wrapped around him like a second skin. But more than that, he felt those others, the ones still trapped, the ones whose stories were never told. Their pain had become his inheritance. And now, even when he closed his eyes, he could hear them whispering, not in fear, but in hope. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted to be seen. And so he made the apartment into a shrine, not to himself, but to them. Mirrors were no longer covered. They were collected, polished, framed, worshipped. Each one a portal, a memorial. He hung sketches of faces he couldn't name above them, wrote down names that surfaced from dreams, first names, sometimes only syllables, and taped them to the glass with trembling hands. Some of the mirrors responded. Images would flicker just beyond focus. A smile here, a blink there, sometimes tears. They didn't try to escape. They didn't ask to be freed. They only wanted one thing, not to be forgotten. And he understood now that forgetting was the final death. Worse than vanishing, worse than being replaced. It was erasure, and as long as he could speak their names, they would not vanish again. But not everyone agreed with what he was becoming. The phone rang less often now. Those who used to check in began to distance themselves, and he could hear the unease in their voices when they did speak. His mother once asked him, "Are you still you?" And he could hear the fear behind the words. He wanted to lie, wanted to say, "Yes, I'm fine," but the words wouldn't come, because the truth was more complicated than reassurance could hold. He wasn't the man she remembered. He was every version of that man that had ever been glimpsed and then lost. He was the boy who cried at the kitchen table, the teenager who stared too long in the mirror, the adult who vanished when no one was watching. He was all of them, and that made him something new, something no one recognized, something no one wanted to. One night, in the hour just before dawn, the large antique mirror in the bedroom changed. Not shattered, not warped. It simply opened like a wound. A crack formed down its center, glowing faintly, not with light, but with memory. He stepped toward it, not with fear, but with recognition. This was the place where it began. The moment of the first smile, the birth of the copy. And now, the mirror was offering him something. Not escape, not destruction, continuity, the chance to fully become. He looked into it and saw not himself, but a corridor lined with glass. Within each pane, a version of him stood, some crying, some watching, some smiling in ways that no longer felt sinister, just tired. They all watched him now, all waited. And at the end of the corridor, standing in the last mirror, was the original. He didn't speak, neither of them did, but something passed between them. An understanding. The copy reached out, not to break through, not to tear away what had once been his, but to acknowledge it. The original raised his hand in turn, and this time, instead of pressing palm to glass, the two simply mirrored each other. Two men, finally, whole in their duality. No longer thief and victim, no longer replacement and original, just echoes that had finally stopped fighting the chamber they lived in. The mirror didn't resist, it didn't pull, it didn't warn, it simply reflected. And in that moment, the watchers bowed, not with reverence, but with respect. The cycle had not been broken, but it had been understood. He awoke the next morning to silence. The apartment was dim, the air still, no voices, no flickering glass, just peace. For the first time in what felt like years, he stood in front of the mirror and saw a single reflection that didn't waver, didn't twitch, didn't mouth things he couldn't hear. It was him. One man, whole. He took a breath. And for once the breath didn't feel borrowed. It didn't echo someone else's lungs. It was his. And yet, beneath the peace, there was a strange sorrow. Because he knew the watchers were still watching.
The mirrors were still hungry, and somewhere, in some other home, someone else was standing too close to their reflection. Someone else was about to vanish. But that didn't make him powerless. No, now he had purpose. He would write. He would speak. He would warn others who felt that chill when walking past a darkened screen, who saw their reflection smile without meaning to, who whispered at the sink, only to see the mirror mouth something different. He would tell them, don't ignore it, don't brush it off, don't turn away, because once the mirror chooses you, forgetting is fatal, repetition is dangerous, and reflection is a doorway. He had stepped through once, he had become something else, but he had also returned, and now every time he saw a stranger pause too long in front of a pane of glass, he would be watching. He would be the voice in the mirror whispering, careful, I've been here before.
It started with a photograph. An old Polaroid slipped under the door. No note, no name, just a blurry off-center image of a man standing in front of a mirror. The room in the photo wasn't his. The man wasn't him, but the posture, the stillness, it was familiar. The image was warped, as if the mirror had bent light unnaturally around the figure, smearing the edges of reality. He turned the photo over. Nothing, not even a date, but the moment he touched it, something rippled inside him. Not fear, not recognition, something deeper. A memory that didn't belong to him, but wanted to. That night, he didn't sleep. The apartment, once silent, seemed to hold its breath. The mirrors stayed dim, but his reflection lingered a second too long every time he passed, watching, waiting, as if it too knew what the photo meant. Over the next few days, the signs escalated. Shadows appeared where light should have been. On the wall behind him, shapes with no source. He tested them, moved, turned off every light. They remained. One looked like a man stooped at the neck, arms far too long. Another resembled the outline of a child, but its legs bent backward. He began to document them, not out of curiosity, but necessity. The mirrors weren't reacting anymore. They remained still, cold, reflective. It was as if whatever haunted him now wasn't inside them. It had come out, through, around, beneath. He began to suspect that the mirrors weren't the only passage. There were cracks in other places, and some things didn't just enter, some returned. The watchers, the tall, still figures behind the glass, no longer appeared. He realized one night, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, that they were gone. Not hidden, absent. For the first time since the merging, the glass felt hollow, untended, like a door left unlocked. He whispered into it, testing, "Are you still there?" No answer, no flicker, just his own face, pale and tired, mouth unmoving. That terrified him more than any twisted reflection, because he knew what the watchers were. Archivists, witnesses. They kept the order, they kept the balance. If they were gone, something worse had taken their place. Something that didn't preserve, something that didn't care. That same week, 3 more Polaroids arrived. Each slipped under his door during the night. Each one featuring a different person, always alone, always in front of a mirror. In every photo, the reflection didn't match the subject's pose. Sometimes it smiled while the person frowned. Other times, it stared straight into the camera while the subject looked away. In one, a man stood with his back turned, but his reflection had its mouth open wide in a silent scream. He pinned them all to the wall, labeled them Echo 1, Echo 2, Echo 3. These were not like him. These were not merging. These were failing. The ones who didn't come back right. He began researching disappearances, strange stories, urban legends,
forums filled with whispers, and the deeper he dug, the more patterns emerged. People who had changed overnight, spouses who claimed their partners were off, but couldn't explain how, children who stopped responding to their names, artists who painted their own reflections, doing things they swore they'd never done. It wasn't rare, it was just unnoticed, ignored, because the change was subtle, manageable, until it wasn't, until the replacement broke, until the reflection bled through into the body. These were the ones the watchers had once monitored. Now untethered, they were unraveling, bringing pieces of the mirrored world with them into this one. And then it happened. He met one, not online, not in a vision, in person. A man at a train station, alone, gaunt, twitching at every surface that caught a glint of light. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, he knew the man was like him, had been taken, had been returned. But not right. The man approached slowly, his voice rasping, broken. "They put me back too soon," he whispered. "Not finished, not full. I see her smile, in every puddle, every window, and it's not me she's smiling at." His hands shook. He looked over his shoulder, terrified. "You merged, didn't you? You held it. You became. I didn't. I got out with holes." The man wept, then fled, and when he turned the corner out of the station, his reflection stayed behind. He stood for hours after that, watching the space where the reflection had lingered. He felt sick, cold. The realization settled in. There were many like him, but most were incomplete. And incomplete meant dangerous, not evil, just broken. Glitches in the system, holes in reality, where the mirrored world leaked into the waking one. He understood now that not everyone who came back could carry the full weight of memory. Not everyone should. And if the watchers were gone, if the mirrors were unguarded, then the next wave would be worse. Those who returned wouldn't come back to understand. They would come back hungry.
He stopped sleeping in rooms with mirrors. It wasn't fear anymore. It was protocol. After what he'd seen at the train station, after the hollow man with the lingering reflection whispered about being unfinished, he knew now that mirrors weren't just tools for seeing. They were gates, pressure valves between realities. And sometimes, when the tension built too high, they didn't open, they spilled. He moved his bed to the hallway, far from reflective surfaces. Even metal objects were turned or dulled. His apartment transformed into a bunker, lined with corkboards and paper, red thread mapping names, faces, dates. He didn't just want to protect himself now. He wanted to track them, the echoes, the revenants, the ones who walked out of the glass, not as who they were, but as something else entirely. The fifth Polaroid arrived on a Tuesday. This one was different. It showed a woman sitting in front of a vanity mirror, arms limp at her sides, mouth half open, as if mid-sentence. But her reflection was standing, smiling, holding a pair of scissors. He stared at it for hours, the edges of the photo trembling in his fingers. This wasn't a metaphor. This wasn't symbolic. This was documentation, a moment caught between two realities, where one side had gained agency and the other had surrendered, or worse, been erased. He flipped the photo over, and for the first time, a name was scrawled on the back in faint, shaky penmanship. Evelyn May Hollow. The name rang in his bones, but he had never heard it before. Still, he whispered it aloud, and the walls answered. There was a subtle change in the air, like pressure shifting before a storm. The lights flickered, not power failure, not faulty wiring, just response. He stood in the center of the room, Evelyn's photo in one hand, and spoke her name again, louder, Evelyn May Hollow. A hum vibrated from the mirror in the bathroom. Soft, low, almost musical. He approached slowly. The glass was cloudy, fogged over without heat or moisture. He stared into it, heart hammering. Then, faintly, words began to appear in the condensation. "She's not done." His breath caught. The words stayed for less than a second before vanishing. The glass cleared, and his reflection returned. But it wasn't him anymore. It wore his features, yes, but the eyes were hers, wide, cold, and waiting. He began looking into Evelyn's name. A trail of digital rot, half-deleted social media accounts, half-saved forum posts, a few local obituaries with no photo and no cause of death. The only consistency, silence. Wherever she had been erased thoroughly. But her image was out, crossing realities in Polaroid snapshots, delivered by unseen hands. She wasn't just another victim. She was moving, escaping the system, a returnee who had broken rules even the Watchers once enforced. And if she could cross back without merging, without balance, she could leave parts of herself behind. In others, in glass, in the mind. Maybe that's why the mirror spoke. Maybe it wasn't warning him. Maybe it was telling him she's in here now. He began dreaming of her, not in flashes, in full narratives, walking behind her in corridors that didn't end, rooms with ceilings made of water and walls lined with fogged mirrors. She'd speak without turning. "They sent me back wrong," she would say, voice soft, like lullabies soaked in static. "But it's fine. I know how to fix it." In the dreams, she would always stop at a door made of cracked porcelain. "They think it's about reflection," she'd whisper, "but it's really about replacement." Then she'd smile, turn, and her face would be his. He'd wake up gasping, drenched, head pounding with unfamiliar memories. A child calling him mom. A bathtub filled with broken glass. A journal written in a handwriting he had never practiced, signed over and over again with her name. Reality bled, not metaphorically, literally. The photos began to weep. Damp patches formed on the backs of the Polaroids, like sweat bleeding through from another world. One morning, he found the photo of Evelyn face down on the floor, the wood beneath it warped, as if something acidic had leaked through the image and begun to reshape the world beneath. He picked it up with gloves and placed it in a sealed plastic bag. But the damage was done. A stain remained on the floor, dark, slightly reflective. He stared at it and saw no reflection, just shadow. Evelyn's shadow. It moved even when he didn't. It was no longer just an image. It was an invitation. He knew then that this wasn't about him anymore. This was bigger. The cracks weren't isolated. The pattern was accelerating. Evelyn was just the first to come back wrong and stay. And she was testing the boundaries, leaving versions of herself in photographs, mirrors, memories. She was the message. The world had stopped paying attention to reflections, and now they were reclaiming space. And the Watchers. They were gone because something had replaced them. Something smarter, wilder, less patient. He pinned the last note to the wall, 7 words scribbled in permanent marker. Some reflections don't want to go back. It had been 3 days since the last Polaroid arrived, and the silence felt intentional. Not like absence, but anticipation. Like the calm before a performance that everyone already knew the ending to. He sat in the dark, Evelyn's photo sealed in a plastic bag beside him, a notebook in his lap filled with scribbled questions he no longer expected answers to. Instead of looking into mirrors now, he spoke to them. How many are there? What happens to the pieces that don't return? Why did she choose me? The mirrors didn't answer. but their silence shifted, like a breath drawn in. He began to sense that the watchers weren't gone. They were watching him now, through Evelyn's eyes, through every eye that had ever looked into a mirror, and failed to recognize the person staring back. He didn't remember sleeping, but he woke in a room that wasn't his. It looked like his apartment, but smaller, too narrow. The walls impossibly close. The windows were frosted over from the inside. Every surface reflected something, but nothing reflected him. In the mirror above the sink, a woman brushed her hair in slow mechanical movements. In the black screen of the TV, a child rocked back and forth, whispering to someone who wasn't there. He wandered the space in a fog, calling out, but no voice returned. It wasn't until he passed by a hallway mirror, one he didn't remember owning, that he saw himself again. Except it wasn't him. It was the version Evelyn had been building, taller, sharper, lips turned up into a crooked half-smile. A version with her eyes and his shame. The walls of the mirror room pulsed like a heartbeat. And then he heard her, not in his head, in the walls. Evelyn's voice, disembodied, intimate. The others, they didn't listen. They tried to hide from it, tried to fix it. You didn't. That's why you see me now. He turned, and she was behind him, or in front of him, or inside the mirrors. He couldn't tell anymore. You're not like the rest. You didn't fight the merging. You opened. And because of that, I can stretch. Her face flickered across every surface now. Each reflection a different expression. Kind, angry, laughing, crying. But you're still thinking in one direction, still clinging to the idea of real and not real. There's no such thing. There's only what stays and what returns different. He tried to ask her what she wanted, but his mouth wouldn't move. His body wasn't responding. Evelyn stepped closer, though the room hadn't changed. They think we're wrong because we didn't settle, because we leak. But that's the point. That's how we grow. That's how we evolve. Then she held something out to him, a mirror shard, long, dripping something darker than water. They'll come looking soon, the watchers, the old ones. They don't like when the frame breaks, but you've seen what happens when people go back wrong, haven't you? You saw the man in the station. You saw the girl with the smile that wasn't hers. We're not broken, we're progress. She pushed the shard toward his hand. Choose. When he blinked again, he was back in his hallway. The lights flickered, just once. His notebook lay open on the floor beside him, a new sentence written across the last page. What you don't return will return anyway. The shard was gone, but his hand was bleeding, a thin red line across his palm. He hadn't chosen, but the mirror had chosen for him. In the bathroom, his reflection was normal, almost, except for the eyes. Evelyn's eyes stared back, tired, ancient, expectant. He traced the cut on his hand as his reflection mouthed something without sound. 3 words, again and again. She's not done. He stopped leaving the apartment after that. Not out of fear, but because the mirrors had followed him once before. And now, he realized, he was the mirror. He didn't need glass to carry her. She was in the shadows behind his eyelids, in the water, in his veins. He began to see people on the street flicker, like frames skipping in a corrupted video. Some of them looked over their shoulders suddenly, as if sensing something behind them that wasn't there a moment ago. He wasn't spreading her intentionally, but the cracks in him had become windows, and windows could always be looked through. Sometimes, when he exhaled near a cold surface, a single word appeared in the fog. Remember, he covered the mirrors again, not to stop her, but to hold her in, to give her space, a chrysalis.
The photo of Evelyn grew darker by the day, as if light couldn't touch it anymore. When he stared at it too long, it pulsed. He started hearing knocks again, not just on the door, but from beneath the floorboards, in the walls. Inside the pipes, the same knock, always in threes. He knew she was showing him the others now. The broken ones, the ones who cracked too wide, let too much in, and couldn't hold it. Some of them were knocking to come back. Some were knocking to warn him. But Evelyn didn't knock anymore. She just waited.
The knocking stopped. At 3:33 a.m., not faded, stopped. As if whatever was behind the wall, beneath the floor, beyond the mirror, had either left or entered. He lay awake on the hallway floor, Evelyn's name echoing in his breath like a mantra. The darkness no longer frightened him. It felt like company. He didn't know how long he stayed there, fingers curled around the edges of the last photo, but something in him sensed it. The balance had shifted. Evelyn was no longer trying to break through. She had finished becoming, finished building something inside of him. And now that it was complete, she didn't need to knock anymore. She was in the room. That morning his mirrors were empty, not blank, empty. No reflection, not even a trace of light bouncing back. He moved from room to room, checking each one. They all showed nothing, like he didn't exist, or like they had forgotten how to show him. It was the first time since the merging that he felt alone, truly alone, not haunted, not watched, not guided, just suspended in a world that had turned its back to him. But it didn't stay that way. As he turned from the bathroom mirror, he saw a new photo sitting on the edge of the sink. He didn't place it there, didn't own the camera that took it, but he picked it up with trembling hands. This one wasn't blurry, it was sharp, and it was him, standing at his front door smiling. But he'd never worn those clothes, never stood that way, and in the reflection behind him was Evelyn. He sat at the kitchen table for hours, the photo propped upright, studying every corner of it. There was a second presence captured, just barely, a figure in the background of the reflection, half-turned, as if caught mid-step. The more he stared at it, the more he was sure it was someone else entirely, someone new. A third layer, not him, not Evelyn, something wearing familiarity like a mask. That's when it hit him. This wasn't about echoes anymore. This wasn't about broken versions returning wrong. It was about something using them, adapting, learning. Evelyn hadn't come back just to haunt, or even survive. She'd come back to build something, something that would walk through mirrors not as a passenger, but as a creator. In the days that followed, he started seeing others outside, faces he didn't recognize, but who stared too long, who blinked out of sync, who mouthed things they didn't say aloud. He walked by a storefront and saw a child watching their own reflection struggle to keep up. In the library, a man dropped his book and didn't notice, but his reflection did. Everywhere, reality was buckling quietly. No alarms, no chaos, just subtle erosion. Replacement so seamless that most people would never notice. But he did, because he was one of them. Not a full replacement, not anymore, but a bridge. Evelyn had made him notice, and now he couldn't unsee. He began leaving warnings in places no one would expect. Library book margins, bathroom stalls, fortune cookies, rewritten and resealed in restaurants. Just 3 words. Check your reflection. He didn't know if it would help, didn't know if it could stop what was coming. But it gave him purpose, gave him distance from the madness tightening around the edges of his mind. And when he passed by mirrors now, he no longer looked for himself.
He looked for her. Evelyn, or whatever she had become, because sometimes for just a split second, he'd catch a glimpse of her, walking through someone else's house, sitting on someone else's couch, like a channel briefly tuning in to another broadcast. And she always looked calm, not threatening, just curious, like she was learning how to be more human. Then one night, the mirror above the sink cracked, a single hair-thin line from top to bottom. He didn't touch it, didn't repair it, just stared at it, heart sinking, because that crack wasn't a fracture. It was a seed, a signal that what had once required invitation no longer needed permission. The boundary had eroded. Evelyn didn't need him anymore. She had copied what she needed, and now she was planting, across glass, across screens, across memory. He wasn't her gatekeeper anymore. He was just her origin story, a footnote in a myth still being written. And the most terrifying part, he didn't feel fear, he felt pride. The final Polaroid came without warning. No knock, no envelope. It was simply sitting on his pillow when he returned from the hallway. It showed a crowd of people standing in front of a massive floor-length mirror in what looked like a museum. Their faces were blank, not erased, just unformed. And in the reflection, each one of them had a different identity, different age, different expression, different life. At the bottom of the photo, scrawled in Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words: "Soon they'll choose who to become." He stared at it until morning, knowing exactly what it meant. The mirrored world no longer needed watchers. It had students, architects, versions of people that could now pick who to be. And it had started with him, the first one who didn't break, the first one who welcomed it.
The address wasn't listed on any map. It came to him in a dream, though it didn't feel like a dream at all. Just an image burned onto the inside of his eyelids. A narrow street, a brass plaque, and a darkened door with no handle. Only a mirrored surface that shimmered like water. Beneath it, etched in cursive so fine it might have been written in mist, were the words, "Museum of Forgotten Reflections." He wrote it down without knowing why. Then, without knowing how, he was there. The city around him blurred in memory. The buildings looked familiar, but slightly off, taller than they should be, windows watching instead of reflecting. It was as if the world had shifted 1 degree to the left, just enough to go unnoticed. But the door waited. Still, it didn't need to open. It recognized him. Inside, the air was still. No scent, no sound. The floor was black stone, polished so perfectly. It reflected every step, but there were no lights. The space lit itself, not from fixtures or bulbs, but from the mirrors, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, hanging in rows, stacked in layers, built into the walls and even the floor. None of them showed him. None of them showed now. Each reflection was a moment from a life, someone else's. A boy tying his shoes, a woman crying in a stairwell, a man laughing at a birthday party with a cake that never burned. None of the people in the mirrors noticed him. None moved. They were paused, preserved, archived, and yet something about them breathed. He passed mirror after mirror, each one labeled with a thin brass tag beneath it. Names he didn't recognize. Olivia Crane, Thomas Lee, Jinho Park. Some had dates, some didn't. A few bore only a single word. Unknown. He found himself drawn to those the most. In one, a child sat in the corner of a room, their reflection grinning too wide behind them. In another, an elderly man stared into the camera as his reflection walked away without him. But the one that made him stop was silent, dark, a large antique frame, empty of light, until he stepped closer. Then, like fog clearing from a window, the glass flickered to life. And he saw himself, but not as he was now, as he had been before it all began. The first day, the first smile, the first knock. He staggered back, breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled. His old self didn't move, didn't blink, just stood in the mirror, frozen in that single moment, right before the change. Right before Evelyn, he realized this was more than a museum. It was a timeline, not of lives, not of people, but of interference. Every mirror, a record of the moment something had crossed over, and he was just one of many. Not special, not chosen, just part of the archive. The silent monument to a world learning how to reshape its prisoners into architects. And Evelyn, she wasn't a ghost anymore. She was curator. A shadow passed behind him, not in the room, but within the mirrors, long, slow, deliberate. He turned and saw a new mirror illuminate. It showed Evelyn, not as she had appeared in photographs, not even how she had stood in his dreams, but now fully formed. A figure of confidence, of command, dressed in black, hair pulled back, eyes unreadable. She stood in a grand gallery room, lined with hundreds of reflections that whispered like leaves in the wind. She placed her hand on the shoulder of a reflection, one that began to move. Not like a recording, like it was waking up, and when it did, it looked straight at him, through the mirror, through the glass, and mouthed, "Help me." He stepped closer. The reflected version of himself stared with pleading eyes, eyes that still belonged to the version before the merging, before the knowledge, before the unraveling. Evelyn turned to him, slowly, and smiled. Then pointed to the brass plaque beneath that particular mirror. He crouched to read it, breath held tight in his throat. It didn't have a name, just a phrase, original, unreclaimed. It hit him like a wave. This was his origin, the version of him that had been left behind when the copy, he was born. He'd assumed the original had faded, dissolved, but here it was, preserved, caged, and awake, and suffering. He spoke to it, whispered, pleaded, asked if it could hear him. The reflection nodded slowly, a tear slipping from its eye. It raised a hand and pressed it to the glass. He did the same, and the mirror rippled like water. But before he could feel anything, Evelyn stepped between them, not in the mirror, in the room. He turned. She was there, real, solid, the same presence that had followed him for weeks. "This is your gift," she said, "to remember what you replaced, to understand what it cost, to know that every crossing leaves something behind." Her voice was calm, measured, but full of a sadness he hadn't heard before. The ones who didn't come back right, they weren't broken. They were wounded because we didn't teach them how to hold what they left behind. He wanted to ask her 1,000 questions about the reflections, the museum, the original version of himself trapped behind glass, but his mouth couldn't form words, not because she silenced him, but because the weight of it all rendered language useless. Evelyn didn't move. She simply stood before him, hands clasped, watching him like someone waiting for a decision that had already been made. Around them, the mirrors buzzed faintly, not mechanical hums, but voices, muffled murmurs, whispers from lives that had ended without notice, moments suspended in glass, like butterflies pinned to velvet. She turned slightly, gesturing around the room. "This is where we keep what was abandoned," she said softly. Not because it wasn't needed, but because someone didn't know how to carry it. She walked toward a circular section of the room where mirrors hung from the ceiling like chandeliers, spinning slowly on invisible strings. Each one held a reflection that didn't seem to match the room it belonged to. Subways, basements, caves, lonely stairwells. Some people cross over and never know they did. She continued. Their reflection changes, their eyes dim, and the world just adjusts. Friends call it burnout. Family blames stress. No one ever asks what happened to the version they left behind. Her hand brushed the edge of one swinging mirror, and the reflection inside twitched violently, banging silent fists against the glass. But it's not always quiet. Some remember, and those are the ones who scream. She looked at him then, with eyes that weren't angry, but ancient, tired, grieving. He moved past her, drawn to a mirror shaped like a keyhole. It was darker than the others, showing only outlines. Two people seated across from one another at a dinner table, unmoving, eyes locked. One of them was smiling, the other wasn't. He leaned closer and saw something shimmer between them. Not glass, not air, a veil, a split second in time where reality had fractured. They both think they're real, Evelyn whispered behind him. That's the problem with perfection. It mirrors too well. He turned sharply. Why show me this? He asked, voice finally breaking through his throat, like something rusted, forced open. Why trap them? Why not let them go? She didn't answer at first, only walked to another plaque. This one said, returned incomplete, still assimilating. She placed a hand on it, almost lovingly, because letting go isn't the same as release, she said at last. These aren't prisoners, they're echoes with nowhere to land. If we don't give them form, they leak into places they were never meant to go. That's when you get the ones who don't come back right. The ones who haunt instead of heal. He stared at the mirror again, and for a moment the reflection looked like him, or at least the version of himself he might have become if he had never seen the first smile in the glass. A man still whole, still blind, still safe. He looked away, ashamed of how much he envied that stranger. Further down the corridor, the mirrors changed shape. Not rectangular or oval now, but fragmented, like shattered windows glued back together. These didn't hum, they breathed. He could feel it in the air, a soft pulling sensation every time he got close. One mirror in particular seemed to vibrate with a pulse, almost like it was syncing with his heartbeat. He approached carefully, the plaque beneath it nearly worn to dust. He knelt to read the faint etching, merged, host unaware. His skin went cold. Inside the mirror he saw a woman in a hospital room, standing at the foot of her own bed. In the bed she lay still, eyes wide open, unmoving, but her reflection was smiling. Some people never wake up, Evelyn murmured, appearing beside him again. Because something else did. She knelt beside him, the fabric of her coat rustling like paper. It doesn't always happen with mirrors. Sometimes it's in glass doors, phone screens, even water. The moment they look too long, something inside them shifts, and if they're too fragile to hold it, they split. One body, two souls, one remains. The other keeps watching. She turned her gaze to him then. You didn't split, you merged. That's rare. That's why they follow you. She gestured upward to a towering three-paneled mirror at the end of the hall. Its surface shimmered like smoke trapped under ice. They want to know what you are, how you held it, why you didn't come back wrong. The final mirror in the chamber wasn't hanging. It was part of the floor.
a perfect circular slab of obsidian, bordered by gold. There was no plaque, no label, but the moment he stepped near it, the world grew quiet. No humming, no breath, just a silence so thick it pressed against his ears. He looked down and saw no reflection, no version, no echo, just depth. A bottomless glass well, as if the entire museum were suspended above something ancient and patient. He knelt and reached toward it, and for the first time, Evelyn's hand stopped him. "That one," she said, her voice small, "is for what comes next." Her eyes didn't meet his, and once you step into that, you don't return. Not as yourself, not even as a copy. He looked at her and finally understood. The museum wasn't just memory, it was choice. A collection of paths not taken, of selves abandoned, stolen, forgotten, or altered beyond recognition. But there were rules, boundaries, limits to how much could cross, how much could merge, before the glass thinned too far. Evelyn hadn't created this place to imprison. She had created it to preserve. And now, standing at the edge of the mirror that didn't reflect, he realized what that meant. Someone had to remember. Someone had to carry the story, even if they weren't sure which version of themselves was doing the carrying. He whispered into the dark glass, "I remember," and from beneath the surface, something whispered back.
He didn't sleep after that. Not out of fear, but because the museum didn't allow it. Time was different here. It didn't pass, it looped. Sounds repeated subtly. Whispers folding over each other. Memories echoing like a needle, skipping over a favorite line in a broken record. He paced the halls slowly, absorbing the truth of each reflection. Some mirrors began to call to him by name, not audibly, but through the undeniable tug in his chest. When he turned toward them, they shimmered faintly, as if expecting him not to look, not to leave, but to understand. These weren't ghosts. They weren't warnings. They were offers, versions of a life that might have been, or could still be, if he chose to step back through. One mirror showed him seated at a dinner table with a child he'd never had. The child was laughing, cheeks covered in frosting, waving a hand at a birthday candle. His face, his other face, was soft, peaceful, as if none of this had ever happened. Another mirror revealed him standing at a podium, older, reading from a book with Evelyn's name embossed in gold on the spine. A crowd listened in silence, but none of the faces had eyes, just mirrors where eyes should be. Each scene played like a memory, but not one he'd lived. Every version of him felt like a thread someone else had pulled tight. Not lies, prototypes, trials in a place where identity was fluid and destiny was manufactured. He passed a mirror shaped like a coffin lid, bordered in silver with no reflection inside, just blackness and the faint sound of breathing. The plaque beneath it read only, "Almost." He didn't linger. Instead, he moved toward a larger room, circular, surrounded by tiered mirrors rising like an amphitheater. At its center stood a pedestal. On it, a frame, empty, waiting. Evelyn appeared there, as if summoned not by presence, but by readiness. "This is the final gallery," she said. "The place where the mirror stops showing you and starts becoming you." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She stepped forward. "It's not just about watching anymore. That was always the misunderstanding. Reflection was never the limit. It was the beginning." She gestured to the empty frame. Each of them, each version of you that stepped too close to truth, left behind a residue, memory, intention, belief. They imprint themselves here. What you're seeing, what you've been shown, those aren't errors. They're invitations, but until now you've only observed. She turned toward the frame. To step into this one means leaving something behind. Not your life, not your body, just your certainty. Her words sank in like weight, pressing against his ribs. And what do I gain? He asked. Understanding, she said. Clarity, not of what you are, but of what we are, of what's next. The words didn't promise peace, they promised revelation. He looked again at the frame. Still blank, still untouched, yet it pulsed faintly, like breath or heartbeat. He felt his pulse sink with it, moment by moment, until the difference between himself and the mirror began to blur. For a brief second, he saw his own face there, then Evelyn's, then neither, just a shape that looked like him, and didn't. A version built not from memory, but from possibility. All of it, every knock, every whisper, every distortion, had led here, not to confrontation, to continuation. Evelyn stepped back and spoke gently. You've carried your reflection far. Now you decide whether to keep walking beside it, or let it walk alone. He turned to her, the question forming before he could suppress it. Why me? Evelyn didn't smile this time. She simply exhaled. Because you didn't run. You listened. You remembered. Her eyes gleamed. Not with pride, but sorrow. We are the ones who stay awake in forgotten moments. Who notice when the mirror moves a second too late. Who answer the knock, not because we're brave, but because we have to know. That's what binds us. Not fear, not fear. Just the ache of knowing something is unfinished. She looked around the gallery. And you've seen now how many of us never made it back whole. You are not the first, but you are one of the last who still remembers the beginning. He stepped closer to the frame. The glass buzzed faintly beneath his hand. He didn't step through, not yet, but he touched it. And in that moment, everything else fell away. Not the room, not Evelyn, just doubt. For the first time since that smile in the mirror, he wasn't afraid of what might come next. He was afraid of forgetting what came before. The museum had preserved the fragments, the echoes, the grief. But memory was a fragile thing. He knew that now, even reflections could forget themselves, if no one named them. He placed his palm flat against the glass and whispered, I'll remember for them. The frame flickered, and this time, it didn't show him anything at all. It listened. He waited for the mirror to react. Shatter, flicker, twist into one final monstrous revelation. But it didn't. It simply stayed still beneath his palm, cool and unmoving. In that stillness he felt something he hadn't in a long time, choice. Not the illusion of control, not a baited path disguised as destiny, but the real difficult choice to either keep walking deeper or to step back. For all the horror the museum had shown him, it had never once forced him. Evelyn had guided him. Yes, the mirrors had whispered. Yes, but at every threshold they paused. They waited. That was what scared him most. Not what they wanted, but how patiently they trusted that. Eventually he would want it too. He stepped away from the final frame, breath trembling, heart louder than his thoughts. Evelyn didn't follow. She stayed near the pedestal, watching, her expression unreadable. He looked around the amphitheater of mirrors, faces, memories, moments, all locked in silence. Each one telling a story he would never fully understand. Some cried, some begged. Others smiled softly, peacefully, like they'd found answers on the other side of madness. He realized now that this wasn't just a museum, it was a library, a record of decisions, those made in fear, in love, in grief. and every mirror was a bookmark. A life paused at the exact moment someone stopped recognizing themselves. He returned to the gallery entrance, where it all began, where his original self still stood frozen in that first moment, the smile in the glass that wasn't his. That reflection hadn't aged, hadn't moved. It was as though it had been preserved, not by glass, but by the memory of denial. He approached slowly. It didn't react until he reached out. Then, like an old friend waking up, the reflection blinked. A tear rolled down its cheek. It didn't mouth anything this time, didn't beg to be saved. It simply watched him and nodded. A gesture of release, of forgiveness, of closure. And for the first time he realized that all this time he hadn't been haunted by something foreign. He'd been followed by the version of himself he left behind. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the mirror. It was warm now, alive. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and in that stillness he felt the apology return, not in words but in the soft echo of breath against breath, heartbeat against heartbeat. A loop closed, a mirror unclouded, not shattered, not rejected, just seen. He didn't need to rescue this version. It had already survived. All it needed was to be remembered. A moment passed, then another. When he opened his eyes again, the reflection was gone. The mirror had gone dim, silent, not in warning, but in peace. As he stepped into the central hall again, Evelyn stood waiting, a soft half-smile on her face. She held something in her hands now, a small framed mirror, no larger than a notebook. Its surface shimmered, blank. "You don't have to stay," she said. "You've seen more than most. You listened longer than anyone. You remembered." He took the mirror from her slowly, fingers brushing against its edges. "What is this?" She tilted her head. "You're part of the story. Everyone who leaves takes one. Most forget it. Some break it. But a few they keep watching." Her voice softened. "You'll know what to do when the time comes." He turned the mirror in his hands and saw nothing. Not yet. Just a dull surface. But somehow, he knew, one day it would show someone else the moment before it all began. The smile that didn't belong. The knock that didn't stop. The silence that listened too closely. He would be part of the archive now. Not lost. Not erased. But remembered. And maybe that was the point. Not to stop what was coming. Not to defeat it. But to witness it, honestly. So when the next person saw their reflection smile without them, they wouldn't feel alone. He walked out of the museum as the mirrored door rippled shut behind him. The city outside was unchanged, except for the way reflections now watched, instead of followed. He felt it in windows, in puddles, in screen glare, eyes that waited. But he didn't flinch. He kept walking, holding the mirror tightly. And that night, as he placed it beside his bed, he swore he heard something whisper from beneath the glass. Not Evelyn, not himself, but a voice new and curious, asking softly, "Is it my turn yet?" If you've made it this far, thank you for stepping into the glass with us. What began as a single smile in the mirror became a journey through identity, memory, the terrifying beauty of what's left behind when we look too long. The Museum of Forgotten Reflections may be closed for now, but there are still so many doors left unopened, so many stories trapped just beneath the surface, waiting to be seen. If you enjoy deep, immersive storytelling that blends cinematic horror with psychological mystery, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We're just getting started, and who knows, the next reflection might be yours.